Let's get peppy. This is PEP 104. Apparently, this is the 1 year anniversary of the phrase "Let's get peppy."
Wow.
Someone on YouTube, I've forgotten your name, I'm sorry. Someone on YouTube pointed this out. I really, really, really appreciate you pointing it out because I did not know. Who would have thought all those months ago that we'd be celebrating 1 year of Let's Get Peppy?
What an honour to be here on this momentous occasion.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to have you here too. This is Melina Wicks, our guest today. Melina Wicks, for those who don't know, is a producer / writer on just about every show on television. There's a lot of TV shows that you've been working on, including Planet America. Not at the moment, but she has in the past. And that's how I found out that she actually was obsessed with American politics just like me. And I started talking to her about it and found that she knew more than I did. And so I'd like to get her on the podcast. And she's been so popular, by popular acclaim. People have been demanding, when I say by popular acclaim, I mean one person on YouTube asked for you specifically by name, and that is one more person that's ever asked for me or Dave or Bill or any of our other guests. So
I'll take it.
You're ahead. That's pretty exciting. As you can see, Melina's got a little bit of the me's about her. That she likes to make notes beforehand as well, just like me in the laptop. So this is a double laptop special. This is also a bit different because this is a pre-PEP. We are actually recording this. Do you remember back those lazy, hazy days of last Thursday? We're living that day right now. This is last Thursday. I believe you people in the audience right now are living next Tuesday, I believe. That's my plan to put this up. But Melina's a pretty busy person. As I said, she works on a fair few shows. She's also a new mum, and so she doesn't have a huge amount of time to spare. And so this was kind of the best time we could get her. So we're going to try the pre-record. As a result of that, since this is a pre-PEP, we're picking 3 topics that we think will not have changed considerably by next Tuesday. But if they have, well, I'm sorry. I do reserve the right to jump on board. If this is the second thing you heard after me in 2 or 3 days' time giving you an update, then some real bad shit went down. But presumably in either COVID, future Congress, or abortion. They're the 3 things we want to talk about. I hope that I did not have to feel compelled to record that little update. So let's see how we go. We are not going to, let's not even pretend that this was recorded in 4 days' time. Let's not be doing the last week's when we mean this week at the moment. Let's not do that. Our audience aren't stupid, okay? We can just realize that we are recording this 4 days ago. Okay, so how are you going anyway?
Pretty good.
Yeah. Well, what actually are you working on at the moment? Because I know you're working on a lot.
I'm split across a few different shows at once.
I told you, she works on everything.
With a mix of writing and producing and development, which is fun, but also keeping one eye on American politics just for fun in my spare time.
Thank you very much. I know you're interested because you keep on G-chain me all kinds of stuff. So, and they're always good stuff, which I then steal and put on the podcast and claim as my own. Why don't we, like I said, we got these 3 topics. Why don't we get straight into it because we only have a limited amount of time here before the studio is taken. Let's start with COVID because that's something I keep on threatening to talk about. You should get a bit closer to the mic there. Right?
Sure.
There we go. And
wouldn't it be great if COVID was over by Thursday?
Just imagine.
I mean, Tuesday.
It'll be a massive waste of time to everyone listening, but
worth it.
It'd be worth it. It would be worth it. Okay, well let's start with the numbers like I always do whenever I talk about COVID. We're looking at about 330 deaths a day these days. I mean, obviously it varies. These are averages because they don't even do daily numbers anymore. They do weekly numbers. That's down from 3,300 a day at their peak in January 2021. Until a few weeks ago, I don't know about now, it's pretty close, I think. But until a few weeks ago, COVID was still the number 4 killer in America. Would you care to guess some of the other ones?
Heart disease.
Yeah, good one. Heart disease, cancer and accidents, apparently. That's a pretty broad category.
Does that include road deaths?
Don't think so. I think it's like tripping down stairs and all that kind of stuff. Falling off ladders. And COVID was still ahead of stroke, just. So that's why I said as of a few weeks ago, because it is reducing the number of deaths, and it was only just ahead of stroke. So it might be number 5 now. Deaths, obviously, that's a very specific measure. Like there's nothing vague about that. Also, hospitalizations, nothing vague about that. That's down to about 20,000 hospitalizations with COVID. But what there is a lot of vagaries about is case numbers. I mean, it was always a bit vague, but now it's really vague. We have no idea. Officially, it's 35,000 a day still, new cases. But number one, like I said, they're only doing weekly updates these days, and God knows what's going on a daily basis. There's no real encouragement for people to report positive results anymore. Also, tests aren't free anymore. So lots of people just don't bother testing for that reason, especially given if they test positive and they don't have any serious symptoms, they might still not be able to go to work, and there might be a pain in the ass. I mean, the rules are changing a little bit in that regard. But still, there's very little incentive for people to report testing these days. And if you think to yourself, I won't make that much of a difference. Well, tell you what, the University of Washington have done a bit of research on this. They did a bit of a survey. And they found that, it is a pretty big survey too. They found that about 4 to 5% of cases are being recorded officially. so that's quite a difference. There was another survey I saw of 3,000 people when they surveyed them and tested them, which backed that up as well. They found 24 times more COVID cases in their testing range than reported from that group. So I mean, like it's something in the order of multiply by 20. There's still a fair bit of COVID out there, but we just got no idea how much. So you might go, well, that's not very good that they have no idea. How can you plan public health around that? And the answer is they don't. They don't plan public health around tests anymore. They plan it around wastewater samples because you can't lie with your piss. so that's the best way. Obviously, you don't know which individuals are tested, but they know whether an outbreak is on the way or whether they've got a problem from the wastewater analysis, because COVID does come through in the wastewater. So that's your basic numbers. I assume you don't have anything to add to any of that. No, that's pretty preliminary. Let's get the stuff that you will have something to add on. The major question over the last 6 weeks, basically since Biden opened his trap in his interview, and is the pandemic over? And what I'm referring to there when I talk about Biden opening his trap in the interview is this right here.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. And so I think it's changing, and I think this is a perfect example of it.
So according to Joe Biden, it's over. According to the Biden administration, it isn't over. In fact, he just used the pandemic emergency as his fig leaf excuse for the student loan debt relief. You've heard me complain about that incessantly on this podcast. Only just this week, the Biden administration extended the emergency declaration to January. It was expiring this week, and they just re-extended it. And what that means, the emergency declaration, is that they have expanded Medicaid and higher payments for hospitals during this period. So that kind of makes sense. And they're extending until after winter, which seems reasonable because there'll probably be another spike then. And also, to be fair to the Biden administration, even though it might seem a bit silly still talking about this pandemic, even though people have kind of moved on, 12 states also still have states of emergency declared, including Texas and Georgia, which have very Republican governors. So it's not a partisan thing. It's not necessarily a crazy thing to do. What are your thoughts? Do you think the pandemic's over?
Well, I mean, the language he uses there is sort of quite imprecise, and then he says the pandemic's over, COVID's not, but the pandemic isn't. the pandemic is COVID. Like, that's what it is. Yeah. But I mean, obviously what he's trying to say is the sense of it being this emergency where we're going to stop our lives and have lockdowns and mandates is that people are moving past that. And I mean, that is true in the way that he describes, in the sense that people like governments are increasingly not going to those levers, and people increasingly in their own lives are making choices about not wearing masks. A lot of people aren't getting boosters. A lot of people are not afraid anymore and are just going about their lives as they used to with very little thought to it. So, I mean, he's correct about what is obvious to everyone, which is that we've moved into a new phase. I don't think he's trying to say that it doesn't exist and that people shouldn't be worrying about it, but it's kind of a semantic thing, really. Like that, the term "the pandemic is over" is obviously factually incorrect, but I think what he's trying to say is broadly right.
Yeah. I think that, look, there is a scientific, well, kind of a technical definition of what a pandemic is, as opposed to like the flu exists, but you wouldn't say we're in the middle of a flu pandemic. Yeah. It's I think Leanna Wen, who I've felt a certain amount of sympathy for throughout this entire pandemic, in that she just seems to constantly get attacked from everyone. Whenever someone's just trying to be sensible, just everyone attacks them. And she had an article about this a few weeks back, which I thought a lot of sense. I've got a quote here for you. For most of the country, the pandemic is effectively over because it is no longer affecting people's day-to-day lives. To them, COVID has evolved from a dire, deadly disease to one that's more akin to the flu. It's still something people want to avoid, and they'll take basic steps to do so, such as getting an annual vaccine. Some might choose to take extra precautions, such as masking in indoor settings, but the societal end of the pandemic has already arrived. This signals the end of an emergency state, as COVID has evolved into an endemic disease rather than a pandemic disease, which that sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
I will go through some of the indicators, though, which I think are more interesting, because we're talking about facts there rather than semantics, as you say. Mandates, they're all gone. CDC's relaxed all their restrictions completely for COVID. There's no more 6-foot rule, nothing like that. There's no more masks unless local transmission is high, and there's no way they can know if local transmission is high because they're charging people for tests these days, as I've already established. There's no more rules distinguishing the vaccinated from the unvaccinated, which was an important part of the pandemic. There's no more mass testing of groups at school or in the workplace, and none of that is happening anymore. In terms of day-to-day indicators, Live Nation Entertainment concerts, which is the biggest promoter of concerts in America, in 2022 they attracted 20% more people to concerts than in 2019. So that's a bit of an indication. Theatres, symphonies and other arts groups, though, are down by 32% on 2019, which is, I suppose, not a surprise. That's probably older people than concerts. Yeah. The American Gaming Association says casino revenue has hit second straight record. I don't know how much that's online, but still, I think it's largely in person in casinos. Weddings are back, apparently. Funerals are not. Don't know how that works. People still die. I guess part of COVID.
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, I certainly went to a COVID funeral where it was largely televised. Like there were like 12 people in the actual church, and the rest were watching through Zoom or whatever. So I guess that kind of thing's still happening.
I mean, part of the thing with weddings as well is you would have a backlog of weddings of people who put them on hold during lockdowns, during the pandemics, and are catching up now, whereas funerals kind of time sensitive.
That is an excellent point. This is what I'm talking about with Melina. She makes really good points. That is true. That's absolutely true. Yeah, you can stack up a wedding. You can stack up a funeral.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't want to.
Yes. Restaurants. About 63% of restaurants' business used to be takeout, delivery and drive-through before the pandemic. Now it's 80%. Was 90% during the pandemic, so it's starting to drop down a bit. But the actual business is still right up there, which isn't a surprise. People need to eat. Major league numbers back to 90% of 2019. The one thing that hasn't returned, there's one area of the society that hasn't returned at all. Would you care to guess what that might be? I'm putting you on notice here. I didn't give you any preparation for this.
I don't know.
It's okay.
Like entertainment oriented or just any point in life?
I'm talking about like commercial activity, like like businesses and stuff. There's one kind of business that really hasn't.
I would have
bounced
thought
back.
office workers in CBDs.
Yeah, well, I mean that's certainly
If that counts.
that's certainly a case, but that's not what I've got in front of me. The answer is gyms. Gyms have just not recovered at all.
Interesting.
Now I know America, there probably weren't too many people going to gyms in the first place, but yeah, for what it's worth, that's the only area that doesn't seem to have bounced back. But largely, most businesses have kind of bounced back. The biggest, to me, indicator that it's over is TV talk show audiences aren't wearing masks anymore. they, to me, were the canary in the coal mine, the TV talk shows. But, anyway, you referred to polling before. I've got a few quick polls here. Morning Consult, 12% regard COVID as a severe health risk in their community now. That's not much. As of August... This is a few months back, obviously, but only 28% still wore a mask in most settings. That was New York Times. The reason I said in August as opposed to in October is because it's really hard to find polls about COVID now, and that to me is actually the best indication. If you're looking around for polls about COVID, they're just not taking them anymore. Like it's just not a point of interest. In fact, I saw a 538 stat. Now, it was in March 2021, half of all national polls tracked by 538 featured at least one COVID-19 related question. Whereas in September, just 14% of polls had at least one COVID-19 related question. And let me tell you, as someone who went through those polls, I'm finding less than 14%. At least they might have one question, but they don't go into much detail at all these days. So that to me is a bit of an indication. Do you have any thoughts about any of that?
Well, the one thing I want add like generally on the kind of, is the pandemic over? And, when you see the differences in numbers between, for example, like concerts in the theater and stuff, like one of the things people always go to from the very beginning of the pandemic is it better or worse than the flu, COVID? Is it more or less dangerous than the flu? And I find that a really unhelpful talking point, regardless of which side you're coming from to use it, because there's such a massive difference in how it affects people of different age groups, COVID. And that has always been what's really difficult in terms of conveying public health messaging around COVID to people. The fact that for a large portion of the population, it's not that big a deal for them personally. And for another large portion of the population, it's very deadly and incredibly dangerous. And as we're sort of moving into this phase where it's sort of, most people are vaccinated, we're kind of like moving on with our lives, it still people keep bringing it back to this, is it better or worse than the flu? And it's like, obviously, if you're over 60, you can and should take more precautions, even now that we're out and about, than someone who's younger, who's probably already had it at least once, if not 2 times, and knows that they're fine and doesn't want to shut down their lives indefinitely to prevent it. But you would hope, if they did get it, would be very, very cautious about not going to see their elderly parents or not going to an old folks home or to a hospital. And so there's like a common sense element in terms of how to deal with it in your day-to-day life that's not either or, like take it seriously and do all the precautions, or, absolutely nothing, let it rip, like party time for everyone. And that kind of benchmarking it to the flu, which obviously affects younger people much more significantly compared to COVID, is, I think, a really unhelpful benchmark for how seriously to take it. Because it depends so much on the context.
That's a great point. It's like there's 2 different diseases.
Yeah.
There's COVID for the young and COVID for the old. And while it might take the same form, it has completely different effects.
And there are obviously exceptions for people who are immunocompromised, and some people are just unlucky for whatever reason. They have some other thing that means that it's bad for them. So obviously, like, you don't want to be cavalier about it in any circumstance. But, like most of the young half of my family have had it and are fine. And most of the older people in my family have not had it because they take more precautions, and we take precautions around them to be more careful not to spread it to them than to each other. That just makes sense.
Common sense. So I suppose the question then is, where's that leave us for the next variant? Because there is going to be a next variant. There already is a next variant. There's about a dozen Omicron variants out there already.
Yep.
It's a case of which one takes over next. There's, in the news over the last couple of weeks, there's been 2 in particular, BQ1.1 and BQ1. They've moved in the last month from 1% of cases in America each to about 5.5% of cases in America each. So they're growing relatively rapidly. And there's another variant called XBB that hasn't really made it to America yet, but it's in other parts of the world. And it does appear to be the best variant for evading immunity. So that's what people are sort of paying special attention to that one. All three of them, though, are still taken care of by the latest vaccines. Like, when I say taken care of, we know that vaccines aren't quite as 100% as we hoped originally, but they still do plenty, and those three are affected by.
And by the latest ones, you mean the ones that are targeted to Omicron?
Yes,
and its
the
subvariants.
bivalent vaccines, which well, I'll be getting to in a second, which cover both the original strain of COVID and the Omicron strain, which I don't think is available in Australia yet. I think it's getting pretty close. I think it's been approved, but I don't think we can get them quite yet. I must admit, I'm holding off my latest booster until that comes out, which I've been told is not a good idea, but I am because I want to get those new ones. Anyway, talking about the next variant as well, the news in the last couple of days. I don't know if you saw about this. Did you see the Boston University story?
No.
Okay, well, in conservative news, they're quite keen on this story. Boston University scientists just announced they've created a new variant in the lab. Where they placed the spike protein of Omicron on the original COVID virus, and they call it the Omicron S-bearing variant. They found that this new hybrid strain produced 5 times more viral particles than the original Omicron, and it killed 80% of a particular breed of mice. Right? Now, people went nuts about that last stat. Hang on, 80%? Like, normal COVID's killing what? 1%? Less than 1%? Whatever. Yeah, 80%? Don't freak out that much. Now, I'm not wild on this new variant developed by Boston University, which I'll get to in a second, but don't freak out from the 80% number like every conservative publication I've been reading the last few days is, because the original COVID killed 100% of that breed of mice. That breed of mice was bred to be COVID sensitive for experimentation. Okay, so don't get carried away by the 80%. I didn't want to alarm you by saying that, but I just want to just put it out there, because if you read anything about this, that's the first thing you'll read. 80% of mice died. No, actually, as far as danger goes, this variant is somewhere between Omicron and the original. It's more dangerous. It seems, well, we haven't tested it on people, thankfully, but it seems to be more dangerous than the original, than Omicron, but less dangerous than the original, but spreads at the same rate as Omicron. So actually, this would be a nasty virus if it got out, because it would be an upgrade on Omicron, but spreading at the same rate. And Omicron is easily the easiest spreader out of all the variants. So it's not great that they developed this variant. And obviously they did it for experimentation purposes. They didn't do it just to be crazy mad scientists. But still, you get a little bit nervous. And the thing that's most worrying about this is that this was funded by NIAID. That's Anthony Fauci's group. But NIAID didn't know about it. Like these guys, the Boston University, their program was being funded by NIAID, but they didn't think to tell NIAID that they were developing this variant. NIAID discovered this in the news reports when newspapers rang them up and asked them about this strain. That's not a great situation to be in. So,
have they explained why they created this specifically, like beyond experimentation?
They were trying to say, I must admit, I tried to get my head around this and found it a little bit confusing. And I thought to myself, what's going on here is newspapers not understanding what's going on. And so they're explaining it poorly. And I didn't really have the time to go to the original paper to have a look, because that's normally what I do. I would just spend a few hours going through the paper. I didn't have those few hours because I was preparing the rest of this podcast. But, so I can't tell you precisely, but it appeared to be a desire to discover what is the part of the Omicron virus that makes it so transmissible. Mm-hmm. Is it the spike protein, or is it other parts of it? They were trying to isolate. They're trying to work out ways to be more efficient in targeting Omicron through vaccines by messing with it to see what turn bits on, turn bits off, see which bits respond. That's the idea.
I would say if you're doing that kind of work, obviously you want scientists to be focused primarily on science and not the media. But if you are going to be creating worse COVIDs, I feel like you should have a press release ready to go that is easy to understand, so that you're not left with either reactionary, like crazy media or read the full research paper to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
That's
not
ideal in my opinion.
I also feel you should tell the people who are funding you that you're doing it. Especially when it's their job to regulate. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. And I suspect NIAID are a little bit concerned about that as well. There might be some asses being kicked behind the scenes, I suspect. But but look, while I was saying, don't freak out, it's not quite as bad as it seems at first. It is still not great. And this is a real problem. I know people like to kick the inverted commas conspiracy theorists around the head a bit, but some of their points are reasonable points, which is it's not, gain of function is not a great idea at this point in time, because sometimes there are mistakes. No one's, well, I hope no one is suggesting they're evil and trying to destroy the world, but you have accidents. There was an accident in Taiwan last year where this was Taiwan, they have real labs. They're not dodgy fly-by-night labs. And in a real lab, a real secure lab, one of the lab assistants was bitten by a mouse with COVID. They caught COVID from the mouse that they were experimenting with. And they had to shut down the whole lab they had to isolate everyone for months. And it might have been too late. If they were dealing with the wrong variant, that could have been, the beginning of Planet of the Apes or whatever. I don't know if you've seen Planet of the Apes, but it starts off with this kind of variant. I'm not suggesting there's a Planet of the Apes virus out there, but just for the movie buffs. My point is that you really, no matter how many precautions you take, it is possible to make a mistake. And so, you want to watch what you're doing, I reckon. And especially in America is a bit of a sitting duck because the government's stopped subsidies for testing, like I said. Most of their COVID treatments are now in the commercial sector. Vaccines are still free, but I don't know for how long. We have no idea how much they're going to charge for various things, antibodies, etc. And they've changed pretty much nothing else since COVID started. They haven't changed ventilation. They haven't changed, they haven't brought on sick leave. You think if they learnt one lesson from COVID, it's have sick leave, because otherwise you spread it to all your co-workers. But anyway, well, let's talk about what America did. Let's move on. Obviously, let's start with vaccines. That's a pretty big area. There's a lot of reevaluation of vaccines going on at the moment. There's always more data. We obviously rushed them out early, when we knew they were kind of safe and that they kind of did their job. But you obviously get more data over time. There's a few studies. There's one from Florida, Florida just now have just recommended recently that 18 to 39-year-old men don't take mRNA vaccines. I'm talking about Moderna and Pfizer there, not J&J. Especially if they have pre-existing heart conditions. And they cited a study there that found an 84% increase in cardiac-related death amongst 18 to 39-year-old men within 28 days of an mRNA vaccine. Now, 84% increase in the chance of death means not much death, okay? Because not many people are dying between 18 and 39 with cardiac-related activity. But it's a matter of measuring that up against the risk of if they get COVID. What's the risk of an 18 to 39-year-old man dying with COVID? Not much.
Plus, when there are other vaccines there are alternative vaccines you can use.
Exactly, like Johnston. Exactly. So we're talking very, very small risks here. We're talking about weighing up different risks. And and also given that Florida, everyone's had COVID. So there's a certain amount of immunity out there as well. So it makes it less likely that they will get COVID again. When we're in the context of a post-COVID world, especially in America where everyone's gotten COVID, the risks reduce of getting COVID. But the risks are the same of having some kind of heart condition from the mRNA vaccine. If you're 18 to 39-year-old man, for whatever reason, they're more predisposed to this particular condition, myocarditis.
And does that take into account that if you have that predisposition, you would also be predisposed to having a bad heart reaction to getting actual COVID?
Yes. Well observed. I was going to get to that. There are many studies showing that you have a 7 times greater risk So that's 700% if we're using the number 84% before. A 700% chance of getting a greater chance of getting myocarditis if you get COVID. But once again, when you take the vaccine, you have a 100% chance of taking the vaccine. When you don't get the vaccine, you don't have a 100% chance of getting COVID, especially if you've already had COVID and all the rest of it. So they're balancing those things. But just but no, absolutely, that's one of the issues. That if you get COVID, you have a much greater chance of getting myocarditis, whether you're an 18 to 39-year-old man or not. But I should also say there's some other factors as well. The people were a bit nervous about the Florida Surgeon General long before this. He's a real doctor. He's a real doctor with real qualifications. But yeah, he was always a little bit on the let it rip side. And so people were a little bit sus, the first thing. And the second thing they're a little bit sus about is that paper that they're basing it on. It's not peer-reviewed. It's preliminary data. There are no authors listed. Completely anonymous. That's never a good sign. When people don't put their name to it, that's never a good sign. They judged the people who died by heart disease in this study from death codes on death certificates. Those death codes are largely for insurance purposes. They can be vague, they can be ambiguous, and they can be inaccurate. But that's where they got their data from, right? It was a small sample size. I think it was 20 people who died from myocarditis from the vaccines. It means if there's an error, 1 or 2 people with death codes, it makes a huge difference in the results. So there's that as well. They only picked certain death codes related to heart disease, not all of them, which was odd as well. The study itself, let me quote the study. The anonymous writer of the study had a certain degree of shame. And they said, in the study, this study cannot determine the causative nature of a participant's death. We use death certificate data and not medical records. COVID testing status was unknown for those who did not die with COVID. So they could have also had COVID, some of these vaccine people. Because remember, you can get COVID after you've had a vaccine, especially soon after you've had a vaccine. Yeah. It takes a while for the protection to build up. The underlying cause of death may not be cardiac related, they say. In this study. So there's some red flags there. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that you shouldn't loudly scream about this stuff on Fox News. That's all I'm saying. It's just something to take on board. But on the other side of things, they're not the only study in town. Some European countries like France, Germany, Sweden, Finland have already recommended that males under the age of 30 do not take Moderna because of heart-related reasons. So even if this study is slightly off, it's not a million miles off. Like other people have independently come to the same conclusion. The Danish Health Authority now actually limits shots for Danes under age 50. You're not allowed to get a vaccine under the age of 50.
Any vaccine.
Any vaccine. Well, no, any COVID vaccine.
Yeah. But of all the different kinds of COVID vaccines.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're making the point J&J as well. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Or
AstraZeneca. Or,
I don't think it's because they've got, the impression I get is not because they've gone, oh my God, we've done the tests and there's so many risks from vaccines. It's more a case of they think there's so little risk for these people from COVID under 50. It's not worth taking a chance with the unknown until you can prove it's 100% safe. I think that's the logic. I don't 100% know. But anyway, I'm just stating it. It's just a fact. Except for, of course, if you're at higher risk for whatever reason for being severely ill with COVID, like if you have some respiratory issue or something, you can take the vaccine, obviously. Or if you work with elderly people or in the healthcare sector as well, you can take the vaccine in Denmark. But anyway, I won't get too caught up on the details of this kind of thing. I just want to just give just more information as it's come to hand. The fact is, though, broadly, vaccines haven't stopped greatly reducing the chances of harm from COVID. If you take them, that's the bottom line. Like, let's not change that. And I'm not just doing this to not get banned by YouTube. That is reality. Okay. The questions these people are debating are the relative chance of suffering, and we're talking very small numbers either way. So it can be a bit ticky touch wood. And And those numbers, as you correctly said before, vary greatly depending on what kind of people you're talking about as well, with what kind of risks. Interesting, this week, the CEO of Moderna himself compared future COVID boosters, not this one, but future COVID boosters to flu vaccines. He said, quote, "I think it's going to be like the flu. If you're a 25-year-old, do you need an annual booster every year if you're healthy? You might want to, but I think it's going to be similar to the flu, where it's going to be people at high risk, people above 50 years of age, people with comorbidities, people with cancer and other conditions, people with transplants." That's what the CEO of Moderna says. So that sounds kind of sensible. Do you have any thoughts about vaccines in general before we get to the "they lied to us"? Can I?
No, let's get to that.
Okay, let's get to that. All right. The biggest story about vaccines in the last couple of weeks, if you've been following it all, is a viral video which has been going absolutely nuts everywhere. It's a Dutch politician. Let me play it to you. Here we go.
If you don't get vaccinated, you're antisocial. This is what the Dutch Prime Minister and Health Minister told us. You don't get vaccinated just for yourself, but also for others. You do it for all of society. That's what I said. Today, this turned out to be complete nonsense. In a COVID hearing in the European Parliament, one of the Pfizer directors just admitted to me, at the time of introduction, the vaccine had never been tested on stopping the transmission of the virus.
Was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunisation before it's entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science to really understand what is taking place in the market.
This is scandalous. Millions of people worldwide felt forced to get vaccinated because of the myth that you do it for others. Now, this turned out to be a cheap lie.
Melina, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I saw that video circulating, and it sounds bad in the context of that video. So I was curious about it. I went and looked at some of the broader hearing. Do you want to set up what the context in which it happened?
I'm not sure I can. Do you want to say that?
It was in the European Parliament, I believe.
Yes.
And they were questioning a executive from Pfizer. As I sort of looked into it more, it became apparent pretty quickly that in terms of whether Pfizer lied or not.
Sorry. I should just specify. I thought it said in the video, but maybe it doesn't. That we're talking about Janine Small, Pfizer's president of international developed markets, was the person who was speaking. The second person who was speaking there. The first person was a Dutch politician. So this Dutch politician interrogating the Pfizer's president of international developed markets, who said, "Yeah, we didn't test for transmissibility." Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, which I'm not a medical expert. That sounded bad when I heard it, and then as I read about it, it was pretty easy to find pretty quickly that they never claimed they were testing transmissibility. And generally when vaccines are being tested, that's not what they're being tested for, because that's quite a ropey thing to measure in terms of how much something is transmitted. If you think, it kind of makes sense when you think about it, when you're testing a vaccine, you want to know, does it stop people getting really sick and dying, which is what we know that the vaccine does. That's been backed up that was demonstrated in the original trials, and that's been backed up through usage all around the world. Many lives have been saved. It's really great. I think in terms of the transmissible element, it's not a gotcha against Pfizer, because they never claimed that it could do that. There were, however, quite a lot of politicians and people in the media who did claim that the vaccines could stop transmission, including Biden, but also many other people in the media. And I think it's unfortunate that so many people did do that, because I think in the rush to kind of try and encourage as many people as possible to take the vaccines, people overstated its effects and tried to use this moral argument of, even if you don't care about it, even if you don't think you're going to get sick, do it for everyone else. And if you don't do it for everyone else, you're a terrible person and you're a granny killer and all these sorts of things. And I think that was not, even though there is a very strong argument for everyone taking the vaccine just because we want to reduce deaths in general. And there've been plenty of stories of people on their deathbed with COVID regretting not taking the vaccine. There is also, I think, a society-based argument to take it, even putting the transmission element aside, which is to reduce the strain on hospitals.
Yes.
Which, if you remember, like that was the argument for lockdowns at the very beginning of the pandemic. That was the big fear, the hospital systems would be overwhelmed. And if you've been to a hospital anytime lately, which I have with a little kid, like you can see the strain that the system is under even now, even with vaccines. So
That's an excellent point.
if it does help people, if people don't take the vaccine and get sick and end up in the hospital, that can still have a negative effect on other people as well. If they then break their leg or have a heart attack or have some other illness and the hospital system can't help everyone as well as they should be able to because they're dealing with the strain of treating people who didn't get vaccinated. So I think that's a meaningful reason to get the vaccine from an altruistic perspective, but that's not the case that was being made by a lot of people at the time. And I think a lot of people in kind of leaning hard into this moral argument have kind of crept away from it since it became increasingly obvious that the vaccines wouldn't stop transmission. And the other element, of course, is Omicron, which came later than the vaccines and is better at evading immunity than Delta and other previous strains. So part of it is the situation did meaningfully change as well. But that, I think, rather than people explaining that and explaining how, what we do know and what we don't know and, in a kind of more like rational based way, by leaning heavily into the moral argument, now I think a lot of people in the media, and especially on the left, because it did become politicized as a left-right thing, have just quietly crept away from that argument and never really fronted up about what we were wrong about. And I think that's unfortunate because I understand why the people who are vaccine skeptical feel kind of gaslit by that.
Yeah.
And then say, look, they lied to us. They were lying the whole time. Like, it was all bullshit. It was all a trick. And therefore, you're more inclined to sort of attribute nefarious motives to people because you think they lie. So I think that it does a disservice to people, and especially the kind of people who are not the like hardcore anti-vaxxers, but the people who were a bit nervous about it and felt kind of pressure and now are like, well, what was that all about? I think that it's the long-term effect is quite negative, that people aren't just saying, this is what we were wrong about. This is what we've learned since. And yeah, it kind of, the risk I think is more for subsequent, whether it's subsequent viruses, subsequent variants, you sort of lose the public trust with the people who are kind of more in the middle or a bit more persuadable by not being honest about what actually happened.
I think that is all 100% correct. I think that you made some excellent points there. I would also add, oh, by the way, this wasn't just that Pfizer and co didn't claim it reduced transmissibility. They specifically said they hadn't tested it at the time. I remember in December that the CEO of Pfizer specifically said they hadn't tested for transmissibility. He didn't know. So this is not a new revelation. But as you say, it was entirely ignored by pretty much everyone who wasn't a Pfizer exec. So, like, I don't expect Joe Biden to know the finer details of epidemiology. So actually, even though I've got some receipts here, like just where are we got I can't find the Joe Biden quotes. We've got a few of them, but I don't expect him. I expect him to be a bit vague. He's vague about everything, but I specifically think he'd be vague about viruses. But I do expect people like Fauci to know what he's talking about. Like, and Fauci in May 2021 said, the vaccinated people become dead ends for the virus. There's no evidence for that. No, so that's wrong. He shouldn't say that. Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC. Now, I got a real problem with her. People who've listened to the podcast for a long time will know that she's been wrong more than she's been right. She's been wrong a lot. She doesn't get criticised like Fauci because she's wrong in all kinds of ways. She's not prosecuting any particular agenda. Like, she's wrong. She's wrong in ways that anti-vaxxers like sometimes. But she's just always wrong. And she was wrong about this as well. She said, in March 2021, vaccinated people don't carry the virus. Now, that is super wrong. That is just... So, yeah, so I blame them a bit. Like they should know better, those kinds of people. But a few things. Let's not assume that it doesn't reduce transmissibility. Yes. Like all because they hadn't tested for it doesn't mean it doesn't. Now we know it doesn't eliminate transmissibility, that's for sure. We know that from the real world. But my question to them is, why haven't you tested it now? I know why you didn't test it in December 2020. You're trying to get the vaccine out. And the most important thing is it doesn't kill people and that it helps people dying from COVID. I get that. It's been 2 years since then. How come you haven't tested it since? Because that to me is something that if it doesn't affect transmissibility at all, not only do you want to be straightforward with that, like you just said, but also that will help you develop better vaccines for the next generation. So it strikes me that that's kind of weird and negligent that they haven't tested it. Like quite aside from whether we were lied to or whatever, I just think that that's good science. They should have tested that by now, and they should be trying to improve that particular aspect of vaccines. That's the first thing I would say. And also that everyone's just assuming that it doesn't affect transmissibility at all. We have no reason. We have no evidence to assume that.
Yes.
Just like we have no evidence to assume that it did stop transmissibility. We have no evidence to assume that it doesn't. No one's tested it either way. So just bear that in mind. With the lying thing, like you make a great point that they're setting themselves up for this by being less than transparent. But that really annoys me, how much people have been accusing doctors of lying over the last few years. They throw the word lie around way too much. Lie means to intentionally mislead. Yes. Like these... Now, there's way too much mind reading going on about what people's intentions are. People get things wrong a lot, especially with a new pandemic where you're rushing and you're under pressure. You get things wrong. They got a lot wrong. That's okay. I mean, it's not great, but that's being human. That's just like that goes with it. You shouldn't assume that people have malign motives every time they get something wrong. I think generally people are just very harsh with each other. You talked about the hurling invectives like granny killer to people. Like there was this period there, which I'm sure you all recall, where half of Twitter was just going around highlighting people who weren't wearing masks in Bunnings and stuff and just wanting them to die. Just people were very harsh with each other. I just felt like there wasn't a lot of grace. There wasn't a lot of understanding. And it was a tough time for everyone. And I thought that just like people expected other people to be kind to them, I felt like they should have been kind to other people as well. And this is part of that, the people not being kind to doctors. Even people like Walensky deserve some understanding. I'll give it a little bit. I mean, she was wrong, but I don't think she was malign. I just don't think she was very good at her job. That's all. And also her and Fauci basically lived on TV. So I imagine that, it's easy to make a couple of mistakes when you're constantly talking. And, while you're talking, you're not getting information as well.
And also, the whole thing with COVID is a novel virus and people didn't know anything about it before a couple of years ago because it didn't exist. So, you have to give people some, we learn a lot about it in an incredibly rapid period of time and develop vaccines incredibly rapidly. It's actually amazing. But the idea that no one would ever get anything wrong, also the early discourse around masks and how effective they were or not, it's not people lying for the sake of it or for some other reason I can't even invent in my mind for why they would want to do that. It's just people are trying to figure it out and they're trying to help with the best information available at the time for the most part. And some people did get carried away as well with their rhetoric, more in the media side and the political side than the experts and doctors side. But for the most part, people were just trying their best in a difficult situation.
You raise a really good point there, by the way, about what's their motivation to lie. And I will pick that up in a second. But just before I do, I just want to say one thing about the lying thing. I do a little bit blame the sort of the journalistic left a bit for this, a little bit, because I'm very conscious of the fact for the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a real push amongst that group to call out, inverted commas, lies. Like what used to be called falsehoods, they go, no, it's a lie. from journalists, from people who are reporting supposedly facts and they're mind reading the politicians that they're reporting on. I've got just this week, Margaret Sullivan, who was the ex-public editor for the New York Times, she put out a book. I got a quote here. Too many times we acted as Trump stenographers or megaphones. Too often we failed to refer to as many falsehoods as lies. Well into his presidency, journalists didn't want to use the word lie for Trump's constant barrage of falsehoods. To lie, editors reasoned, means to intend to be untruthful. Since journalists couldn't be inside politicians' heads, how were we supposed to know if, by this definition, they were really lying? The logic eventually became strained, given that Trump blithely repeated the same rank mistruths over and over. And look, it's true. Trump does do that. You know, he probably is lying a lot of the time. He probably is. But we don't know that. And if you're a journalist, as opposed to a pundit or an analyst, if you're a journalist, you shouldn't be calling something a lie unless you know it's a lie, unless you've got evidence. And I really hate that. And the word lie just got used all the time. And now it's being used all the time with doctors. And it's just, it's just part of the world becoming harsher. And I don't think it's a constructive trend, I would suggest on that. So, but just pick up on what you're talking about the motivation. What's their motivation for lying? It's a good question. Like, if you think someone's lying, ask yourself, why are they lying? Let's take the doctor's example, because that's what I'm focusing on now. When people ask what their motivation is, they always say, something like, for control. And you go, whoa, hang on, how does you wearing a mask give me control over anything? Or you taking a vaccine? I don't get this. You know, like it's why would a GP want to control you anyway? I don't understand what's in it for them. Like, what do they get out of that? Do they make money out of that?
I would think they make more money if there's more sick people.
Yeah,
Doctors.
that's right. Yeah, exactly.
There's lots of people to treat.
It's the very opposite. Why would Joe Biden want control over you wearing masks? I don't get that. If anything, I'd piss you off. Look at China at the moment. They're getting pissed off by the zero COVID thing. Like, I don't see how it helps you. Don't see how it helps you get reelected. The only kind of way I can think of that vaccines and so forth lead to control is if you're this guy here. This is Stephen Hotz. He's a pastor and a doctor, apparently, and this is his reason for why vaccines lead to control.
So this is how it works. You're injected with graphene oxide. Once injected with the so-called vaccine, you become connected to the Internet of Things, and you can be mind controlled by artificial intelligence through maybe 5G. Why are they putting 5G everywhere? This is transhumanism. The Internet of Things. How would you like to be connected so your thinking would no longer be your thinking, but it would be non-biological? The real question is, who will control the computers that give you the messages?
Okay, so unless you're that guy, I don't understand how a vaccine or a mask gives you control over anything. I don't get that at all. Another thing which they suggest is that also, by the way, the people who are saying that it's control, they're talking masks being control. Fauci, remember, one of the things he gets criticised for is that originally he was soft on masks and then he changed his mind. So if you think he's trying to control you with masks, what was he trying to do before? None of this makes sense. But then there's also the for profit. The people saying, it's for profit. Okay, I get how Pfizer makes a profit. Yeah, that makes sense. I get how people who've invested in pharmaceutical companies make a profit. Sure. How about everyone else? How about everyone else who's involved in this conspiracy? You know, like I don't understand. Like, by the way, I should say, something that the right have been going on about a bit is Fauci added $5 million to his household net worth from 2019 and 2021. That is a fact. But it's from $7.6 million to $12.6 million. But $3 million of that was from his private investments. $1 million of that was from a prize from Israel for being a great dude. He did get $1 million of royalties from drugs that he was involved with. Now, I don't know the details of those drugs, and no one does. So maybe that's something an enterprising journalist can try and look into. But until you get some kind of evidence, even Fauci's got nothing to do with this, like the profit. And I don't know how Joe Biden profits from it. Like, it just doesn't make sense. I don't see any reason. I mean, are you with me on this?
Honestly, I think a lot of it is just that people don't like being told what to do. Like last year, before we had the vaccines here, I was just like chomping at the bit to get it. I couldn't wait to get vaccinated. I was worried about the virus. I wanted to be vaccinated. I was one of the people being like, hurry up. Like, what's with the delay in Australia? Like, can we get this already? And then as soon as I got as soon as I was part of the people who was told they had to get it, there's just some little part of me that bristled that's like, don't tell me I have to get it. Like, I did get it because I wanted it, but there was a little part of me that was still annoyed being told that I had to get it and that I had to prove it and stuff. And so I think if you're the kind of person who doesn't already really want the thing, a lot of people are just like, don't tell me I have to wear a mask. Don't tell me I have, even if it's sensible and it's for your own benefit. And especially if it's someone that you don't agree with politically telling you that you have to do it. I think so much of it is just that instinctive reaction that are like, I don't want Joe Biden telling me to get a vaccine.
And I get that. Like, I mean, I'm libertarian.
I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying I think that's what's going on for a lot of people.
I totally get that instinct. I have that exact same instinct. In fact, I have that instinct strongly. Like, I totally get that. And I totally get skepticism as well. Like, I mean, as you can see, over the last half an hour, I've been talking about, you know, the ins and outs of vaccines. Where I get you wanting people to prove that something is worth doing. I get all that. Like, I get obstreperousness. I didn't say that word right, but I get it. What I don't get, like, it's all right. I think it's good and healthy for a public to want to know what is going on and to demand evidence. What's not healthy is for people to jump to why. I don't get why people insist on having to have a why answer and the answer being because you're evil. Like that's what I don't get. If you want to know why, like conspiracy theorists, they get their back up when you call them the conspiracy theorists because they go, well, hang on, we said that the vaccine wasn't 100%, and look, it's not 100%. We were proved correct in this, and this. Well, you know what? Yeah, you were in this, and this, but at the same time, you also said. And the reason for this, and this is because of the New World Order. It was the why that was the conspiracy. The conspiracy was not, we might be wrong about some of the info that we have about COVID. The conspiracy was that the people who are wrong are actually lying to you because of these malign motives. That's the conspiracy part. So leave the conspiracy out and you won't be called a conspiracy theorist. You'll just be called an annoying skeptic, which is cool. That's just my thought. Do you have any other thoughts on that kind of stuff?
Just I think like a lot of the people who are resistant to getting vaccines and wearing masks are probably not conspiracy theorists, but to me, it's like the flow on of it being so damaging that so much of COVID became politicized because as soon as it becomes a left-right thing, you're going to have like 30 to 40% of the country that are strong partisans that are going to be less likely to do things that they might have otherwise done because it becomes a political thing and it becomes a signaling thing of, you know, the people around me are all against wearing masks for freedom or, you know, because like all the right-wing people are against it. And so then it's sort of, you know, you almost start feeling a peer pressure to not do those things because you've got this sort of polarized state and this sort of partisan identity that's tied up in resisting those measures, which like there's no reason why those things ever had to be partisan. There's nothing left or right about a vaccine or a mask, really. And it's just very unfortunate sort of sign of the times that things like that get sucked into that framework and then people just stop acting in their own interests because and people just sort of adopt this kind of very antagonistic rhetoric that we were talking about before with all the unkindness because it becomes a political debate rather than what's the best thing to do for my health.
Absolutely. Obviously, this is a huge problem for the new vaccine, which I flagged before. The bivalent vaccine has just come out. Well, it came out 3 months ago in America, and only 7% of eligible people have taken it. So that gives you an idea of where it's at. Yeah. We're talking about 14 million people in 3 months, which is not much for America at all. It's more than the flu, but not much more than the flu. There has been concern about it not being tested on people, but that's pretty standard. When you take a vaccine that's already been tested for safety and you tweak it only slightly, they will often not test it. They'll often just test it on animals before they release it. Like they do that with flu vaccines all the time. So that's not actually unusual. But yeah, it's just not picking up, which is a bit of a shame because it would be handy. But although the big development isn't the bivalent vaccine, it's actually not even in America. The big development's in China and India. They've got nasal vaccines now, which they don't in America yet. And the reason that's a big deal is because the immunity goes into your nasal mucus as well, not just your blood. And so that's where obviously you're breathing through. So it's actually more effective. You need less of it for that reason. You can get, like, apparently you only need a fifth of the active ingredient for a nasal vaccine than you do for a blood vaccine, which means that there are less side effects as well and less symptoms. So it's good. And also, you'd be surprised how many people object to needles. Like, that's actually a big deal. And those people can take nasal vaccines. So if vaccines hadn't been completely ruined for the whole of America, then this would be something to look forward to. It could make a big difference in the future. But that's where we're at anyway. Let me just quickly run through the red state, blue state thing, because there's a lot of studies have come out about that since then. 84% of Democrats are vaccinated, 65% independents, and 63% of Republicans. So actually, it's not the Republicans who are the outliers; it's the Democrats that are the outliers. It's the people who are more likely to get vaccinated are the outliers than less likely, which is something that you might not have known until now. There are also divisions by race: 72% of whites versus 61% of blacks. That can't be right. Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, 89% of postgrads versus 83% of college grads versus 63% for those who didn't go to college. So there are divides otherwise. There are three main studies that I would refer to quickly about the red state, blue state thing. First study from May 2021 found higher local viewership of Fox News channel was associated with lower local vaccination rates. You'd be surprised to hear. But it doesn't have to be, but it could be a correlation without a causation. Like you might go, there's other reasons, maybe it's for partisan reasons or for age or for all kinds of reasons. And also associated with reported vaccine hesitancy in local survey responses. You'd be unsurprised to hear. They can rule out most other causes though, because watching CNN or MSNBC in the same locations had no effect whatsoever. Also, they tested Fox News watching Republicans versus non-Fox News watching Republicans, and the non-Fox News watching Republicans had no effect as well. So it's Fox News.
Yeah, I would note, without getting into the whole story, we talked the other day about Tucker Carlson's Kanye West interview and the then subsequently leaked excerpts from that interview that they did not put to air. And it did strike me as notable that the things that he said that they chose not to put to air were anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, conspiracy theories against his friend being killed by a fashion designer, and the fact that he took the COVID vaccine. So that kind of tells you something about their editorial line at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great call. The second study is a really interesting study. Analyzed 600,000 deaths in Ohio and Florida, only those states. It found registered Republicans had far higher excess death rates than registered Democrats during the pandemic. Note, they weren't testing for COVID. Excess death rates. And that's really important because that then removes all COVID reporting issues. Like going, oh, well, they didn't report COVID, or they said they had COVID, but there was something else that killed them, or did COVID actually kill them? Removes all those issues, just excess death. So that's actually a really good thing to do, I think. It's obviously, and the interesting thing about this is, as I said, Republicans had higher excess death rates than registered Democrats during the pandemic, but not the whole pandemic. At the very, very beginning of the pandemic, and there was no difference whatsoever. Then, as they moved into the pandemic, they opened up a difference. From April 2021 onwards, the gap opened up massively. Let me give you the numbers. For the first part of the pandemic, there were 76% higher death rates for Republicans and Democrats. From April 2021 to December 2021, which is when their study ended, there were 153% higher death rates for Republicans and Democrats. So there's an obvious change when the vaccines came out. So with that, my conclusion from that is that vaccine hesitation was the difference, and that was clearly a Republican thing rather than a Democrat thing.
Although also, to be fair, with the sort of like trajectory of COVID, it did start in the major cities as well, and then gradually move into the kind of like exurban and rural areas, which are more Republican. That's
right.
too.
But remember what we're talking about here is the places where we're talking about the red state places where they actually could say this person is a Republican, like this has a certain percentage of Republicans, this has a certain percentage of Democrats, etc. So we're talking about in those places. We're not talking about in New York versus Florida. We're talking within Florida.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter when the death rates came. When the deaths came, they came more to Republicans than to Democrats early on, and even more so after the vaccines. So I find that a really interesting study. And I'll tell you the thing, not only is I think is the excess deaths really useful, but the best thing of all is that because they actually went through the voter registrations of the people who died, like on an individual level, which means they can control for all the factors affecting those individuals, like age and like education and like all these other things. So they could actually remove all the other potential factors other than your political registration. So that's why I think it's a really, really good study, because I think especially age, you could see how if you didn't control for age, you go, well, Republicans are older. People who watch Fox News are older. They're the people who die. So that would I think invalidate any study that didn't control for age, whereas this one did specifically control for age. By contrast, there's another study which got a lot of press, which I think is rubbish, which was out recently as well, found a high rate of deaths amongst Republicans and Democrats, same result, and it was a national study, so it got a lot more attention. It actually suggested the gap was more attributable to other public health measures such as masking and social distancing than vaccines. But I'm ignoring it because it didn't control for age. So I think if you're not controlling for age, I don't care what you have to say. When you're talking COVID, because COVID is just such a, as you say, it's a pandemic of the old. So do you have any other thoughts about the Republican, Democrat, red state, blue state thing?
Just that it is the unfortunate outcome of health becoming partisan, because it's not a good thing that all those extra people died. And, it, again, like it doesn't feel like it had to go that way.
I'm conscious that we got to get onto, you know what? Let's pause COVID. I've got other stuff on COVID, but let's pause COVID for now. Let's just get on to abortion, because I know you got a lot to talk about that, and we do have a time limit. Although we are, I think, almost certainly going to do a bit of Zoom extra after this time limit, because I want to use you for all the stuff we have to talk about. So why don't we'll just do a little pause on COVID, and we'll come back to that a little later on. Abortion time.
2 hours did always feel ambitious.
It did. Talk to me about abortion. Now, you don't want to talk about the politics of abortion, do you? You want to talk about the actual reality.
Yeah. So I think what's sort of been interesting to me in the period of time since Roe v. Wade was overturned is that there's just, I think most people don't like to think about the issue of abortion in detail because, to put it crassly, it's kind of icky. Like, I think people on the left and right don't really like to think about it in detail. And I think that's why in issue polling, you often get, this general sense that people want it to be legal to an extent, but not unlimited in its legality, and not a lot of clarity about where to draw the line, because people just sort of don't want to think about the particulars of it. But since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there's just been obviously like this flood of media stories that all kind of, look at different aspects of what it means. And there's been a lot in that coverage that surprised me. I felt like I'd heard a lot about that issue over the years. And I think it was just like, I think that the narratives on both sides of the debate have been very set for decades. They just had a couple of talking points on the right and the left and basically repeated them over and over. And this massive kind of societal change that's coming with this change in the law, I think is very significant. And the fact that for me, there were just lots of elements of it that I'd never thought about it before was interesting to me. And so I just kind of wanted to collate all the kind of various things that I've sort of heard in the past months into kind of like a big picture look at what it means outside of the kind of, polling and voting, because I think it's going to be a long time before we see any real electoral implication for this, not least because there are structural issues for why, even if the Democrats do have an upswell of support off the back of this, it doesn't necessarily translate into power from a legislative perspective. But also because the initial ruling of Roe v. Wade had huge implications, and it still took decades before that meaningfully changed the other way. So I don't think that, I'm not really interested in, if or how it would affect the midterms. I'm more interested in what this actually means and why this is going to be a massively contentious and complicated issue in new ways and continuing ways for a very long time.
Okay.
So I think that, first of all, it's just helpful to rattle through a few stats about abortion in general so that we just get an idea. I know you like stats.
I do.
Don't play the sting though. It's a serious topic. But just to kind of get a sense of who we're talking about when we talk about who's getting abortions in America. For starters, it's a lot more than I would have thought. Nearly half of pregnancies among American women in 2011 were unintended. So that's a lot.
Yeah, I'm surprised. by that.
And of those, about 4 in 10 were terminated by abortion. In total, 21% of all pregnancies, excluding miscarriages in 2011, were ended by abortion. All these stats, by the way, come from the Guttmacher Institute, which is kind of the go-to place for abortion stats. Some of the numbers are kind of a bit old, but generally the trends kind of they don't sort of fluctuate. So you can kind of assume that unless corrected, these are sort of a relatively good indication. In terms of who has abortions, 12% in 2014 were teenagers. So it's some were young people, but also much older. 59% of abortions were obtained by patients who'd had at least one previous birth. So a majority of people who get abortions are already mothers. 49% of abortion patients had incomes less than 100% of the poverty level. So obviously poverty is a huge aspect here. 51% of abortion patients had used a contraceptive method in the month when they got pregnant, which I thought was interesting.
That's a big number.
It is a big number. And I think a lot of when Republicans are talking about, wanting to stop abortion, I think the image they always want to conjure is of someone who is irresponsible and, kind of not taking things seriously and, could easily have prevented it. And so it's kind of their fault if they get pregnant and they should wear the consequences. I think that is the kind of logic that underpins a lot of their rhetoric on the issue. And so I found it quite interesting to say, it's often not the case. And, without going into all that, but it's a lot of the time people you wouldn't think of in terms of the image they're conjuring versus the reality. So getting to some of the consequences, because I think in terms of overturning Roe v. Wade, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences in the landscape now. I think that because people don't generally want to talk about it in detail, and because Roe v. Wade was in place, Republican politicians for decades now were just incentivized to kind of go harder and harder in terms of their rhetoric and opposition to abortion without really having to think through the consequences of what that would mean in legislation. And now, despite the fact that this is a fight that's been going for decades, everyone seems quite unprepared for what to do in this outcome. And I think that there are a lot of unintended consequences that we're going to see as a result of that, and legislation that doesn't really work because as much as, there is the moral, religious argument around abortion, but when it comes to legislation, you need to draw black and white hard lines around things. And the reality is that it doesn't work that way a lot of the time in pregnancy.
Just before you go on, just picking up on what you just said there about the rhetoric has been allowed to drift because it's been divorced from reality and real consequences. One of the biggest issues, and I'm sure you're going to get into some of the examples involving this soon, but one of the big issues at the moment is that because some of these states are reverting back to previous laws, back from 50 years ago, or some days even 100 years ago. Those laws were created in a time when the rhetoric was completely different, before it had been harshed up. And so one of the problems we've got is that those laws back then were kind of assuming that doctors would often have abortions. Doctors would miss abortions when it was sensible to do so. It was just kind of assumed. And so doctors weren't charged for a whole bunch of things that were, according to the book, against the law, because it was assumed that they didn't live in this culture war world about abortion. And so it was just assumed that stuff would happen. Everyone would just let it happen. But now we're using those same laws written back then in the context of today, when the rhetoric has changed so much and the culture has changed so much. So all of a sudden, when you go by the book and you actually apply it, it's so much harsher than it was actually meant to be. And so you end up with consequences that never would have occurred 50 or 60 years ago with exactly the same law. And that's one of the issues, which I'm sure you'll get to. So,
yeah, well, there's, I think, a lot of areas where, these laws, if applied to the sort of, when we're talking about the strictest versions, obviously there's different laws in every state, but, when we're talking about the kind of strictest versions of these laws, and we're talking about the kind of people who are pushing for more absolutist laws, fully banning abortion in almost every case, there's just a lot of instances, even putting aside, the Republican vision of the irresponsible woman who just says it's not a good time or whatever, like putting that aside, there's a lot of cases that I think most Republicans even would not feel very comfortable about and are obviously not intending when they're thinking of these laws that are going to get caught up in this. So, for example, miscarriage is a major one.
Yeah.
It's very common. Before 20 weeks, about 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage. And I say known because oftentimes you can have a miscarriage without even knowing if it's in the earlier stages of pregnancy. Yeah. So that's extremely common. And then from about 20 weeks, it's considered a stillbirth, and it's 1 in every 100 pregnancies that end in stillbirth. The treatment for a miscarriage involves medical interventions that are effectively an abortion in terms of how they treat that. And if you don't treat it, the risk of infection is significant, which can create major health problems and even kill people. And with these laws, they'll generally allow for a treatment if the fetus has died, but often it's not, again, the sort of black and white letter of the law thing. Like oftentimes, they base that on the heartbeat, and a heartbeat doesn't necessarily stop right away. So there was this case in Texas I heard about recently, a story which is a horrible story, but she was a woman who, it was a wanted pregnancy. She was quite far along and she started to miscarry, but there was still a heartbeat. And the doctors, this was under the new Texas law. It was before the Supreme Court ruling, I believe, but after the Texas law had passed.
Yeah.
And she was miscarrying. The pregnancy was over, but there was still a heartbeat, so they wouldn't give her an abortion to treat it. And they basically said to her, like, you have to wait until the heartbeat stops or you get infected, and then we can treat you, because then it's the health of the mother. And so she's in this situation where she's basically having to go home from the hospital and wait to get sicker, which is awful and not anything anyone would wish upon people on purpose. And she gradually did get sicker and sicker, and eventually it went up to a review board and they intervened and were like, this is ridiculous, we have to help. And around that time, the heartbeat stopped anyway. But this can get like quite serious quite quickly. And it's just an indication of like, it's not the intent of the law, but if people go by the letter of the law, you're going to put these people in a situation where you're deliberately letting people get sicker before you treat them because of fear of prosecution. And that's putting aside the psychological trauma. If you've just lost a wanted pregnancy and you can't get that treated and you're having to carry that around while you wait to get sicker, like you have a situation where something that's already traumatic and horrible is being compounded so much more. I mean, the other thing with...
And you're saying 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is a lot. Yeah. And I mean, it's also, if someone turns up at a hospital miscarrying in one of these states that are hardline states, how will people know if it's a natural miscarriage or if someone's taken an abortion pill, for example, that they've gotten in the mail? I don't think that people are going to prosecute those women because it's so unpopular, but is there going to be an investigation? Are women going to be going through this horrible traumatic thing and having to answer questions from police to assess if they've broken the law or not? Did they become a suspect as soon as they go through a horrible complication of pregnancy? Like you get this culture where women's bodies become the purview of the state, not just in terms of whether you can have an abortion or not, but in terms of the success of your pregnancy, even if it's wanted, being an issue of interest to the state, from a criminal perspective, which I think is a pretty nasty development.
Especially given what we were just talking about the natural impulse that people have to don't tell me what to do with vaccines. I mean, the invasion of messing around with my miscarriage is significantly greater than the invasion of taking a vaccine.
Yeah, well, and in the referendum in Kansas, yeah. I keep wanting to say Kansas, Kentucky. It was Kansas. That was part of the messaging in the pro-choice movement, was trying to equate it to mask mandates to try and pull off a few independents to say, like, get the government like out of my decision making for my body, which is kind of, it's true, but creates sort of an interesting political messaging situation.
I don't know if you're about to go onto this anyway, but when you're talking about the miscarriage situation, having to just go home and wait to get sicker before you can be treated, there are other examples that exist right now. This is not science fiction. This is not an advertising campaign. This is reality, where in some states people who have cancer need to wait before they can get chemo because
Yes.
the chemo will kill the fetus. And so they need to wait until they are so riddled by cancer that they are about to die if they don't get chemo. And needless to say, some people will die because of that.
Yes.
Like, I'm not sure they have so far, but they're going to.
Yeah.
Because if you have to wait to that point, then the chance of success with chemo is reduced.
This is why the difference between the life of the mother and the health of the mother when it comes to exceptions is so important, because there are lots of instances like that which you probably wouldn't think about unless you either happen to hear about it in the news or you go through it personally. And these are the kind of things which I hadn't really heard about until recently, but that is a really great example of, people who need chemotherapy. Also, there are lots of medications that aren't safe in pregnancy. If you're one of the 50%, if your pregnancy is one of the 50% that's unintended and you are on a medication for a different illness that you are needing to treat, like a chronic illness or even an acute one, where you need to take a certain medication, you have to have a choice between continuing this medication that you need for your health or continuing a pregnancy that was unexpected. That's another difficult thing. Ectopic pregnancies is another one. And there's cases where there's been delays in treating women and that's created further complications, significant, very dangerous complications from not treating that in a timely manner. And I think that one of the things that's sort of actually an intended consequence is a chilling effect that you're going to start to get on doctors. So most of the laws are targeted more towards doctors than women in terms of prosecuting people for performing abortions. And I think the logic underpinning it is kind of like with drugs, where it's like, you prosecute the drug dealer more than the drug user, as to why you would logically not punish a woman for having an abortion and punish her doctor instead. I don't think that makes sense when you actually think through the logic for a number of reasons. Abortion providers are not profiteering.
Yeah.
They're not involved in harmful, until now, illegal activities. And abortions are not addictive. Therefore, the people who are seeking them have agency in that decision. That's the problem with drugs.
That's a big difference.
Drug addicts, at a certain point, don't have as much agency in their decision because they are addicted. That is not the case in an abortion. So I don't think that logic holds. But I think part of the intended effect of targeting doctors is this chilling effect where if you say to a doctor, these are the kind of laws, and if there's any ambiguity, you have to use your judgment as a doctor, but you risk going to jail. If you think about it, if you're a woman who's faced with, okay, I can have this procedure to save my life where it's not like I'm going to die right now, but maybe there's an infection that's getting worse or something of that nature. Like, if I'm in that situation, I'm going to risk going to jail to save my own life because I don't want to die.
Yes.
And I'll deal with trying to take on the state, trying to prosecute me after I save my own life. But if you're a doctor, your risk calculation is very different in terms of, do I want to risk going to jail to save this other person that's not me? Doctors obviously want to do the best for their patients. They don't want anyone to die. But I'm pretty sure they also don't want to go to jail and lose their careers and their own families and things of that nature. And so I think that even though prosecuting women is I don't want to see any women go to jail, I think that it's in some ways kind of more insidious to target the doctors in that way because it feels on the surface more reasonable, but in reality you're taking the decision-making power away from women when it comes to their own life.
It's yet another way of removing agency from the woman. Like, everything we're talking about is removing agency from the pregnant woman. Yeah.
Yes. And you also get, I'll get to this in the case of the Ireland case study, which I want to go into later, but you also get situations where judges can make determinations in many instances, which is an even worse version than a doctor deciding. And it is, again, taking agency away from women for their own health, their own lives, which I think is a big issue. Another thing that we talk about a lot is the rape and incest exemptions.
Yeah.
Just a sort of statistic on that, 1% of all abortions are related to rape and incest, and it's 3 million women experience rape-related pregnancy in their lifetime, which like 1% sounds like a small number potentially, although it actually still sounded high to me. Yeah. But 3 million in absolute terms is a lot of women.
It's a lot of people.
America is a big country, so you don't need a big percentage of people to be affected for a lot of people to be affected. One question I have from out of that is, does that mean you have to report the crime of rape to avoid prosecution if you're seeking an abortion? Because most women or most survivors of sexual assault don't report it right away and aren't comfortable to do that for a variety of reasons in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event. So are you forcing people to go through the courts in order to get the legal sanction to get an abortion if you have a pregnancy as a result of rape?
That's a great question. I don't want to be a broken record, but once again, removes the agency of the woman to decide whether she wants to report the rape or not.
Yes. Yeah. I also personally really dislike, there's a lot of focus on the talking point of exemptions for rape and incest from both sides of the debate. I understand why, but I don't like it because if you think through the logic, it kind of like validates the idea that like any instance of an unwanted pregnancy that doesn't result from rape and incest is kind of the woman's fault in some way, which, you know, and therefore like it's a punishment from the state to be forced to carry that fetus to term if you haven't been a victim of a crime, which is sort of, I think, like just like, again, a bit of like an insidious logic that underpins a lot of the conversation around this. And actually, I just jumped back because I remember the other thing I was going to say, which is when it comes to these things where you have the woman's life in your hands, like I said before, a majority of people who get abortions are already parents. And so when you're talking about putting a woman's life at risk, you're not just talking about that woman potentially dying, but also kids out in the world losing their mother. Yeah. So it's significant, it's significant enough for a woman to lose her life. But, you know, we're talking about people who, you know, get abortions for a lot of reasons. But, you know, in many instances, it is, especially in a health case, like the implications of that are so wide reaching.
Like you say, so many of the people who get abortions are already mothers. And it's probably part of the reason that they're getting an abortion is because of the sake of their family. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I was just going to say, this is to use a word you referred to before, an icky area to go into, but it's just something that just occurred to me that I've never heard before. So I'll just throw it out there and you can judge me silently. But the ironic thing about the fact that the go-to exceptions that everyone seems to acknowledge, life of the mother and rape and incest, is that incest, people put rape and incest together every single time. But incest is not necessarily rape. Incest, the odds are that there will be many people who don't fall into those exceptions who are much less wanted to have that pregnancy originally than the person who had incest. Like, the incest might just be someone who actually has a relationship with their brother. Like, a real relationship. Like, and then it comes out and then their family are going, what's going on here or whatever. Just that, like, as opposed to many circumstances which aren't covered by an exception where the woman did not want in any way, shape or form to go anywhere near anything that had like, it might not be an official rape, but she might not have wanted to have sex. Like it might like, or it's a rape that she doesn't want to report, or it's a malfunction of an IUD or whatever. But there's
people in abusive relationships.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just weird that one of the only go-to exceptions that everyone will accept is one where, in a number of cases, the woman might not have actually necessarily not wanted to have sex and have a kid.
To be honest, I've never understood what the delineation that is, in the sense of, like, I always assume that that term was referring to like sexual abuse within families, but then why you wouldn't count that as rape, I don't know. So to be honest, I don't know what the official classification of those things are, but yeah.
Anyway, go on.
The other thing with unintended consequences, they're ones that pro-life people in particular would be unhappy with. So, for example, in a lot of states where they have not total bans but early cutoffs, I read this in the context of Ohio, people are rushing to get abortions before they've made up their mind, because in some instances people, you know, maybe could go either way for various reasons, because they're afraid that if they decide too late that they don't want to continue the pregnancy, they won't be able to get one. So they're rushing to make the deadline without having an opportunity to think through, you know, can I afford this? Like, what are my like plans? Like, how will I manage this in my life? Like, there's no time.
So you're suggesting some people will get abortions that would not have had an abortion if there wasn't a clock on it.
Potentially, yeah. Like, you're not giving people the opportunity to actually sort of think it through. And so the sort of bias is going to be towards getting one as quickly as possible because better to do that than wait too long. And to that, I mean, we were talking about this stat the other day, but fewer women got abortions after Roe v. Wade than before it, which is, I think, a very interesting stat that a lot of people would be surprised by. And also the proportion of abortions obtained early in the first trimester has risen from 20% in 1970 to 56% in 1998. I know that's an old number. I'm not sure what the more recent number is on that, but that's a huge difference.
Yeah. The conversation you're referring to that we had privately, so the people listening that were not aware of this, that I think directly after Roe versus Wade, there was a bit of a spike, and obviously over time, and at some point in time it went up. But basically the last, I think, this is off the top of my head, I have not looked this up before, but I have read this some time back. I think it's the last 10 years or so, basically, there've been fewer abortions per capita than there were when abortion was illegal. Like, it just goes to show that the biggest factor, if you're actually concerned about abortions and not about making some kind of political point, if you're actually concerned about abortions, what you want to work on is contraception.
Yes.
Like, the more available
and sex education.
Yeah, sex
both
education.
Things that a lot of conservatives oppose.
Like the more you work on that, the fewer abortions there are, and we've lived the proof of that.
Yes.
So go on.
Yep. I'll talk a little bit about some of the political implications, not so much in the polling, but just from a policy perspective. I think upcoming over the next years will be a lot of pressure for a federal abortion ban. At the moment, they're trying to avoid that. Lindsey Graham obviously put out his 15 weeks plan as a kind of a moderate compromise middle ground that pleased nobody, it seems. And Mitch McConnell and other Republicans in Congress nationally, response to that was that most Senate Republicans prefer this to be handled at the state level. And that is the official line from Republicans federally at the moment. That to me seems absolutely untenable.
Yeah.
Mostly because if you're like at this point in a post-Roe environment, to say you want to leave it to the states when half the states are blue states that are going to have very liberal abortion laws, you are effectively pro-choice. Like, you're not pro-life.
Yes,
you're
true.
pro-choice. You may only be pro-governors getting to decide who gets abortions and not women.
Yeah.
But by the logic of the anti-abortion activist, if you think it's murder and you're in a situation where murder is legal in half the states and the federal government has the opportunity to legislate that away, you can't just leave that sitting and be like, oh, well, leave it up to the governors of New York and California to make up their own mind. It's none of my business. Like, that's completely untenable. And activists are already putting on the pressure for stricter gestational limits, and also abortion pills is going to be, I think, a major front in the coming fight on all of this.
On that, I was going to say that firstly as well, I think we've seen more than enough evidence over the years that we are becoming more polarized. America's and when there is a possibility to become more extreme, people do without doubt, and the activists are going to place an enormous amount of pressure on Republican politicians who obviously aren't going to want to go there, except for the true believers, and there are increasingly more of those true believers. But leaving that aside, even the ones who think this is a terrible political idea, they're going to get primaried if they don't do it. Like, I mean, just have a look at elections. Like, if you got Republicans 4 or 5 years ago, and you said to them, what would you do if the Republican president refused to accept that they lost the election? Would you support that? They were going, of course not. That'd be ridiculous. But such a high proportion of them have, like over half. And the reason for that is because they'll get primaried if they don't. They don't actually support that bullshit, but they know if they don't say that, they're going to get primaried, and it'll be exactly the same with abortion for sure. The other thing I think as well that will lead towards pressure to move in that direction is that the states will make them do that, because what's increasingly happening is the states are fighting wars with each other, if for no other reason, for governors to position themselves to run for president. So you have a situation where, for instance, this is what's happening in Arizona right now. Right now, what's happening is patients have an ultrasound in Arizona. They get a prescription through a telehealth appointment with a California doctor. and then they have it mailed to a post office in a California border town for pickup. Then they just go and pick up. It's all for free. And it's all for free because California has made it for free because California is trying to undermine Arizona's abortion laws. Like Gavin Newsom's running for president, and Gavin Newsom wants to undermine Florida and Texas's abortion laws. And so increasingly as time goes on, New York and California, places like that, are going to use their huge size and huge budgets to completely mess with the abortion laws of Texas and Florida. And Texas and Florida will try and mess with the California laws as well, with abortion pills and so forth. So like the abortion pills is going to be a real legal battle for sure.
Yes.
But yeah, they're going to mess with each other so much. It's going to become, as you say, untenable for the national government, for the federal government to ignore it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll get to the pills in a second, but just on the kind of legislation, one thing that I think would be interesting to look out for, especially at the federal level, but also at the state level, is which Republicans are going hard on the issue and pushing to actually do this, get all this ideological stuff done, and which ones are looking for off-ramps, which ones are looking for ways to look like they're all with the cause, but actually trying to do something that's like moderate and acceptable to independents and the broader country. Lindsey Graham's bill was a 15-week ban with not very substantial exemptions. To me, the thing that's really important is the exemptions in any bill. Like the weeks, I think, is really almost kind of like red herring. Yeah. A lot of people focus on, and people on the right say, look, we're just in line with Europe and in the weeks, a lot of like Australian abortion laws look on paper stricter than American ones. The weeks thing is bullshit, especially beyond the first trimester. So a 15-week, which is very much beyond the first, 3 weeks, beyond the first trimester, is very restrictive if you have few exemptions. But if it's like in places like Australia and Europe where you have major exemptions, where not just the life of the mother, but the health of the mother, and that's a decision between a woman and her doctor, so then you're encompassing mental health and all other kind of elements like that, then the weeks thing is almost meaningless because most abortions do take place in the first trimester. And usually if you're getting one in the second trimester or later, it's because something has gone really badly wrong. Yeah. And I think it's very reasonable to leave that between a woman and her doctor. And that's the thing I think to look at with any of these laws is what are the exemptions rather than the weeks if it's beyond 15 weeks, because that's when you're really getting into extreme territory, or you're getting people who want to look like they're strict but really are kind of sensible in terms of the actual real world effect of these things.
Yeah, I agree. That's my hobby horse too. For the health of the mother is all I care about. As soon as I hear those words, for the health of the mother, I go, okay, that can be worked.
Yes.
But if for the health of the mother is not there, I don't care.
And in the judgment of the doctor and the mother.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And which is why I always wish that I hate the way Democrats are running from the argument that Republicans are trying to use in the midterms. They're going, oh, what limits do you support then? Like as soon as you say to a Republican, you support no exceptions, they say, well, what limits? They just turn back on you. What limits do you support? And sometimes I go, I just don't think the government should be doing this. And but so you support no limits. I wish they'd just once say, yes, I support very strong limits from doctors. They're the limits. Yeah. The limit is the doctor. You should get a sign off from 2 doctors or whatever saying that it is for the health of the mother. That's the limit. And if you can't get that, then you shouldn't get an abortion. So you can sound all tough.
Yes.
but that to me, I wish they'd respond with that because I think it's a common sense response. But and as you say, I think it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, and broadly things can kind of either go in 2 directions now. Like we can kind of have with polarization and this increasing extremeness, just things getting really extreme and really dire, and a split in the country where like half the country is really liberal and half's really conservative, or a federal law which then basically bans abortion in blue states as well, and all of the kind of like social upheaval that would cause, because obviously that's going to upset a lot of people. It could go that way, or it could go in the way of things seem quite different, but people try to find a way to get back to a status quo in a way to avoid that. And I honestly don't know which way it's going to go, but to me it sort of depends on whether Republicans currently in power are looking for those kind of off-ramps and manage to find them without getting primaried.
Yeah, I don't know what the final result's going to be, but I'm almost certain that in the next period of Republican governance, there's going to be a federal law banning abortion of some kind with some level of exception. And then when the Democrats take over after that, there will be a federal loosening of those laws. I don't know where it will actually end up, but I'm pretty sure that's where we're going to... In about 12 years' time, we'll have something approaching a final law as a result of those two processes. And we'll see what happens there. I was just going to say, by the way, as well, for the health of the mother thing is what the unofficial rule was before Roe versus Wade. That's how it used to be, where it was legally you couldn't... It was illegal to have an abortion on the books, but in reality, doctors gave abortions all the time for the health of the mother. So actually what we're talking about now is, once again, is becoming much, much, much stricter than what it was before when these people said it was fine.
Yes.
So anyway.
Although the big caveat to all that is pills. And that is a big issue as well. In 2020, 54% of abortions were done by pills. This is the medical pills that induce an abortion. It's the first time it has been a majority. Obviously, it's been steadily climbing. And that's obviously just going to rise more and more as more clinics close down. Because this is the thing. It's easy for Republicans to create laws that make it effectively impossible for clinics to operate or to outlaw clinics. It's a lot harder to police pills coming in, especially if they're coming in from interstate or overseas in the way that you described. And many other ways. A lot of clever people are figuring out all kinds of ways to do this. So, I mean, for starters, there's a question of, do politicians want to make the pills illegal and crack down on them? That's an open question. I don't know the answer. And could they, even if they did want to? I mean, obviously activists want to, but do the people who are actually in power want to be trying to prosecute this, trying to catch people importing pills? It would be incredibly complicated, especially to catch, let alone prosecute people bringing in pills from interstate or overseas.
It would mean completely redefining a relationship between the government and you and your internet usage.
Yeah.
So it'd be pretty big.
Yeah. So that in itself is going to be, and obviously there is already pressure. There was this letter sent to the federal Congress that was signed by all kinds of anti-abortion activists and groups that were lobbying to have a federal ban. But in practice, it would be very hard to stop. And there's a question, I think, for me, of how much people even want to be getting into the business of trying. People aren't going to be going to the old school, backyard abortion, alleys to get this stuff done now. It's pills that's going to fill this void, which is already what's happening as laws have gotten, because laws have been getting increasingly restricted over time in various parts of the states. The other thing that I heard about the other day, which I thought was interesting, is this concept of rebranding these abortion pills in a way as missed period pills. Have you heard about this?
I have not heard this.
So it's a move by reproductive rights activists that's somewhat new, but actually harkens back to something that people have been doing for generations prior to more modern techniques. The idea is that if you miss a period, you don't take a pregnancy test and find out if you get pregnant. You just take the abortion pill, kind of like you would for the morning after pill, but a few weeks later. And so you take this pill to treat the medical issue of having missed your period. Okay. And you may have been pregnant and you may have not, and you'll never know, and the government will never know.
Oh, that's clever.
But it's just effectively a contraception. Yeah. And you take the pill and you bleed, and that's either that you got your period or you miscarried, or who knows, because you do it obviously very early. The benefit of this would be it's virtually impossible to prove that you've committed a crime, because you don't even know if you were pregnant, let alone the government. And it's a potential off-ramp for non-extreme Republicans as well to just endorse this idea as a treatment, without calling it abortion, because everyone can get around the idea of it being an abortion, because maybe it's not even. Yeah. The drawbacks are that there are side effects from medical abortions in general, and so women will be suffering those side effects in some instances for no reason, just effectively out of fear of the state, which is not a good situation. It's not better than where they were. The pills are not even considered preferable to surgical abortions in the first place for that reason. And so you'd get women suffering through that for no reason. And the other thing is access. These pills can be hard to get. It can take, you have to figure out where to get them from. In many instances, it might be illegal to get them. You have to know where to get them. 80% of Americans, I heard the other day, don't even know medical abortions exist. So there's a very big knowledge gap.
Education to be done.
And it can take weeks for them to be delivered to you if you don't have them on hand. And obviously time is critical in these instances. So it would take, I think, a certain amount of organization for this to be normalized. But I suppose it's potentially a way for people to, if we're talking about a decades-long change to the nature of these situations, that's like a potential way for people to kind of exist within the law in a way that might be like a little bit of a like an off-ramp for Republicans as well as just women.
Okay. Now, I better stop you here because we're hitting the clock. Now, I don't want to deprive you of your agency, given what we've been talking about, but there is no way in hell that we are stopping this podcast at this point in time. So let's take a little break, and then, not for you guys, for us. And we will regather on Zoom to finish it up because we're about to lose a studio to finish off abortion, go back to COVID and natter on about what everyone natter on about. See how long I can use you for, because honestly, you just spin gold. Melina. I want to take advantage of you as much as I possibly can. That sounded awful. I do not want. Let's just rewind the last 15 seconds. We'll see you guys after the white flash. We're back on PEP 104. Sounds like a radio ad. This is the other side of the white flash. And Melina was telling us all about the next thing she wanted to talk about with regards to the real story of abortion.
Yes, we were talking about abortion pills and the potential rebranding of them as missed period pills. And there was just one other thought on that I just want to add before moving on to the next element of the sort of topic, which is that even though this kind of branding in this sense and its use in that way in the American context is kind of new, it's actually quite an age-old thing that has happened in other countries and in America before Roe v. Wade, where women would see, when they miss their periods, doctors or midwives or like, you know, people in the community, like community kind of health, people outside of medical context, who would provide various like herbs and concoctions and things of that nature back in the day for missed periods when there was some ambiguity about what that was. So it's certainly not progress. It's not a good thing to be heading in that direction, but it's sort of a reversion to this sort of pre-Roe context of people trying to find ways to handle this issue that kind of keeps it within the realm of the woman and her health provider, whoever that is. So that's a kind of an interesting area that may develop. Yep. One other kind of broad that I want to add as well in that context is I think it's not at all certain in a post-Roe world that there will be fewer abortions. Given the rise of the use of abortion pills, and blue states in response to this being like going even harder and trying to be even more liberal and trying to encourage people from red states to come over and facilitate cross-border sending of pills and things like that. Like, I think obviously there will be significant impediments to access, and that might mean that some people who want abortions can't get them. But I think, we certainly can't assume that the result of this is going to be fewer abortions in America, just because there is going to be so much, I think, organization around trying to make sure access is still facilitated. So, but having said that, so another thing from a policy perspective, on the assumption that there will be a lot more babies being born from unintended pregnancies, one of the big questions from a policy perspective is who's going to pay for these babies?
Yeah.
Because one of the big reasons why women seek abortions is because they can't afford to have a baby for various reasons. There are Republicans out and about, politicians, so talking about, trying to kind of put the moral, responsible spin on this new turn of events of, like, oh, we're not the Handmaid's Tale, we're compassionate and we're going to look after these women, we need to support them. Being pro-life is being pro-family and being pro-supporting women with pregnancies, even when they're unintended. And I kind of feel like they have a bit of a vibe of like the deadbeat dad who, a woman gets pregnant and they're like, oh yeah, I'll help. And then when the baby actually comes, there's nowhere really to be seen. One other thing which irritates me very much is nothing was stopping them from helping before the overturning of Roe v. Wade, when red states were systematically stripping those rights and access away over decades for women trying to get abortions. So, I mean, this was still an issue. And if you think that these kinds of things would help facilitate women having more babies, and you're against abortion, and you think that that's a sin, why wouldn't you be doing as much as you could from a financial support perspective all this time for the past 40, 50 years to try and encourage women and create a pro-family, genuinely pro-life environment for women? I'm sure a lot of women would have taken that option. Not all, obviously, but some probably would.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, if you look to how a state treats its poor mothers now, that's some indication how they would treat them after a world in which there's no abortion. And it's fair to say that the super red states, like in particular, I'm thinking Mississippi off the top of my head, are notorious for being really, really stingy on their welfare payments for anyone, let alone for a mother. So if they're not helping them now, why would they help them in the future?
Yeah, and people talk about programs like vouchers for food and nappies and things like that. The most expensive thing about having a baby is taking time off work, by far.
Yeah.
If you don't have paid maternity leave, it's very, very expensive to not have a job.
Yeah.
If you had a job before and you don't have one anymore, or you have to take significant time away from it when you're not being paid. Second most expensive thing is childcare. If you want to keep working and have a baby and not be staying at home with them all the time. The other thing that's very expensive is formula, which is in high use in America. Breastfeeding is free, but again, you have to count the time that you have to take off work to facilitate that, which again is really expensive. So to me, like, the number one thing, if you want to support women to have more babies, is paid parental leave, which of course America famously, only industrial economy which doesn't have it. Paid leave was one of the first items taken out of Biden's Build Back Better bill.
Yep.
God, that's a lot of B's. All 50 Republican senators opposed the plan. Marco Rubio is someone who's putting himself at the forefront of the compassionate conservative, I'm going to help all these mums who don't want to be mums movement. He has a plan for paid parental leave, which frankly sucks. I'm assuming you're across it. It's basically for women to use their retirement savings to pay for their maternity leave, of which women already have considerably less retirement savings. So encouraging them to take more out is making an existing problem worse.
Yeah.
They have to pay it back themselves. So they have to pay back their own maternity leave out of their retirement money, which means they miss out on the compound interest that is supposed to be accruing, which is the whole point of having a retirement fund in the first place.
Exactly. And by definition, if you've just had a baby, you're probably young enough for compound interest to be a massive factor in your retirement.
Yes.
Yeah. So
not helping anyone at all. And obviously the non-starter Democrats aren't going to get on board with that. And if that's the best they're putting forward, I'm not optimistic that they're genuine about this issue. Less than a quarter, aside from there being no federal, overreaching policy, less than a quarter of private sector workers have paid family leave in the States. So if you want to make it easier for women to have more babies, I would start with that.
Yeah. Sounds reasonable.
The other thing that I think is very different now to before the pre-Roe era, which I think will be significant in how all this plays out, is that obviously the news and social media landscape is very different. I mean, social media didn't exist. And the news landscape is very different as well, just in terms of the volume of news and sort of breadth of stories that get covered now. I think you're going to be getting this constant drip of individuals' stories that are horrible and very sympathetic. And, the kinds of people you have in test cases for lawsuits, the sort of unimpeachable victim of a horrible situation, at the heart of which is real people suffering, and that are very hard to defend from a political perspective. And I just think there's going to be a lot. You don't need, America is, as I said before, a very big country. We're not going to have a situation where masses of women are dying in pregnancy because of this, but it doesn't take many for there to be a real energizing effect in terms of the outrage it causes.
And it's not just in terms of people dying, but already we're seeing this. Once again, this is happening right now. I've seen it in Florida, seen it in Ohio, seen it in Arizona. We're talking about 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds being pregnant, having to travel interstate, sometimes across America. Sometimes it's incest, sometimes it's rape. Sometimes, like, they've got horrible stories. And there is, like you say, America is big. There is one of those stories in each state pretty much every week. And it's become the new crime story, I think, for a lot of rural states, where it's just this ongoing drip, 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 and they never get tired of talking about it. I don't think they'll stop talking about them. And I think that, I do think it builds pressure over time, personally.
Yeah, I think so as well, because, and, you put like politicians in the unenviable position where they either can't justify it, which, like in the case of that poor girl in Ohio, like, a lot just struggle to justify it. Some people try to pretend it's a lie, which obviously reflects very poorly on them. And the very few try to actually justify that outcome. And that increases the controversy because people are obviously appalled by that, because the overwhelming majority, even people who are anti-abortion, most people hear those kinds of stories and just genuinely feel awful about them. And that's not, when Republicans are trying to ban abortion, it's not because they want 14-year-old rape victims to suffer. Like, that's not that's not their goal.
No.
And so when these things happen, it becomes very difficult to deal with from a political perspective. And I think we are going to keep seeing those stories over and over. I wanted to talk about Ireland and their experience with this, because I think it's an interesting case study where we could kind of see a similar trajectory, I suppose, they passed a constitutional referendum in 1983 banning abortion, where there was like fairly low turnout. So, it was a question of whether it reflected the will of the people. As soon as it passed, people were working to overturn it, which they eventually did at another referendum in 2018. So we're talking quite a while later. Decades. And there were two major cases that really energized the movement fighting to overturn the law. And, in this case, it's a referendum, so obviously slightly different process, but, it obviously takes a lot of organization, a lot of time to reverse a referendum. And so in this case, the two stories that were a big part of how this unfolded. One was in 1992, where it was a 14-year-old rape victim. She became pregnant. She and her parents had reported the crime to the police, and then she traveled to England to get an abortion, which was what people did in Ireland at the time. But because the police were involved, they found out that she was going to do that and it referred it to a judge. And so the judge, they basically went back to Ireland awaiting the judge's permission to proceed. And she told the judge that she was contemplating suicide because she didn't want, she's obviously extremely traumatized, and at the prospect of having to carry this rapist baby to term, she was saying, I feel suicidal. The judge accepted that she was suicidal. He didn't debate that, but ruled that the threat to her life was not sufficient to justify permission for her to go to England for an abortion. And his logic, so by the law in Ireland, the law was that you had to give equal weight to the mother and the fetus. And the judge's logic was, I accept that you're suicidal. I accept that you might kill yourself. But if you have an abortion, there's 100% chance that the fetus will die, whereas there is a chance you will not commit suicide. And so therefore, not only did he put that ruling, but he put an injunction on her to prevent her from leaving Ireland for 9 months to ensure that she would have to carry this to term. It went to a higher judge who overruled it, and at the same time, she ended up having a natural miscarriage. So that was how that story ended. But obviously, like, you have this absolutely harrowing situation where a judge is deciding whether a 14-year-old victim of a horrible crime is sufficiently suicidal. And the idea that a judge is the right person to make that decision and to have this, like, victim's life in his hand, this poor girl, is obviously appalled a lot of people, create a lot of anger. And I think this is, like, if this starts happening in the States, like where they have, very politicized judges as well, I think that really becomes a potential issue. And so that was back in 1992. So obviously a long time before they finally overturned the law. And the other big turning point was a woman forgive me if I say it wrong, but Savita Halapanova, who was 31, 17 weeks pregnant when she suffered a miscarriage. But similar to what we were talking about before, the fetus still had a detectable heartbeat, so doctors couldn't give her an abortion to basically progress the miscarriage, because that was against the law, basically. This is the nature of these fetal heartbeat laws. She got an infection, and by the time that the heartbeat had stopped and they could treat her, the infection had spread to her blood. She spent a few days in intensive care, and then she died. And the whole time her husband were begging hospital staff to treat her, and they couldn't because they didn't want to get caught up in the law. And the result was that she died. And that was galvanized. Like, I remember that story at the time. Like, you know, it was obviously 10 years ago now, but it really, like, the injustice of that and the injustice of this woman dying, and like not just like in a kind of sudden thing, but spending days begging for help and not getting it because of the system, again galvanized the movement. And then the push began for this new referendum, and it was eventually abortion was legalized in Ireland. And I think, like what we were talking about before, like where I think the parallels are in particular is, in this instance, you have these individual stories. You know, it's not the statistics, it's not the overall situation, it's these individual stories of people who fall victim to these laws and the kind of inflexibility of these laws that don't really like take into consideration people's individual circumstances and the situations in which people can find themselves with these things are like not obvious in terms of, you know, like a heartbeat can continue for a period of time after a miscarriage has begun, things like that. And I think it just doesn't take a lot of these kinds of personal tragic cases to really capture people's attention and energize movements. It's similar to what we see with like George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. It's often these kind of like personal stories that kind of create momentum for change. But I think it does take a long time. And I think activists in the States who care about this issue need to prepare themselves for a decades-long fight. It's not about the midterms, you know, it's a really long-term thing, as it was for conservatives trying to overturn Roe, and like credit to them, they stuck with it and they go on and on. So yeah, I think that it's going to be a long time. I was thinking about the contract. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right about that, because while some of these people might think, oh, yeah, look, this will happen for a little while and then people get bored of the stories, they'll move on. They won't, because it'll be like Fox News with immigration stories, immigration crime stories. They just never stop doing them. Even if the local news stops, and I don't think they will, because like I said, I think it is kind of like the new crime story, like their personal interest, they're really sort of emotional stories. But even if they did, the liberal press are not going to drop off. Like MSNBC is not going to stop covering these things. They absolutely will not. So it's going to be a long haul one way or another. I totally agree. Yeah. And I think, like, I was thinking about the contrast to the guns debate in the States, because obviously we have these high profile events, so especially the massacres, like mass shootings, especially when they're in schools, where, you know, they're obviously very emotional, horrific things, and they don't lead to any substantial change, even over a course of decades. And I think the reason it's a bit different to that is that it is much easier to, like, or it's much harder to take something away from people. So in the case of guns, even though like the status quo has actually been a creeping march towards more and more guns and more gun rights and gun ownership, it still feels like the status quo in the sense of people have guns, they've always had guns, people don't want them taken away. Whereas with abortion, I mean, even though like 40% of the country hated Roe for decades, it had the advantage of being the status quo. And I think for a lot of people, they were just like happy with the status quo, or at least accepting of the status quo. And I think there's very much a sense now that something has been taken away from people. And I think the dynamics of that is very different. So anytime there's one of these stories, even if it's something that could have happened before the law change, I think it will still fit into this picture people have of, oh, you've taken a right away from me and I want it back. Definitely. Also, abortion's, it's simple. It's not, it's flick a switch. It's legal or illegal. It's not like guns where like, it's just like the gun issue is just a mess. Like there are too many guns out there. You can't get rid of them. You can't just click your fingers and disappear them, whereas you can click your fingers and make abortion legal again. So like, so it's just with guns, every time there's a shooting, the first question people who are opposed to gun control say is, okay, well, what would you have done to stop that shooting that just happened now? Because I guarantee you, any law you would have changed would not have stopped that last shooting. Whereas I can guarantee you that any situation that comes from some 10-year-old in Ohio would not have occurred if abortion was legal. So it's a much simpler issue for people to process, I feel. Yeah.
What do you think? Because you said before that you think Republicans will enact a federal law and then Democrats down the line will overturn it.
Yeah.
What do you think happens the next time Republicans are in control? Do they change it again? Is it going to be back and forth over decades?
I think that what happens is, I mean, like, it's all guesswork, obviously, but I think that when people are passing laws and running for election on those laws, they're going to be significantly more pragmatic. I don't think that the national ban in whatever it is, 2026 or whatever it will be, I don't think that is going to be a zero exception ban from 0 weeks. I don't think it's going to be like that because the moderate Republicans are not going to want to run for re-election on the back of that. So I think there's going to be, I think that the national laws will be less extreme than the state laws we're seeing. And I think equally, when the Democrats pass their law, that will also be less extreme. And I think that by then, I think the Democrats will be across the phrase "for the health of the mother," which I think is obvious to us, but not obvious to them quite yet. And I think they will pass laws that are harder to overturn, that are harder to run against. I'm sure it will keep on toggling a little bit, but I suspect after the first 2 toggles, I think the what we call the Overton window, which is the space of reasonable disagreement, will be much smaller than it appears at the moment. So I suspect that they'll be fighting over very, very minor differences in the laws in 15 years' time. If it does continue to be an issue, which it might not, it might just drop out. Like healthcare has just dropped away. For the last 10 years, we've been arguing over extremes of Obamacare versus nothing versus Bernie Sanders care, whatever. I mean, that hasn't disappeared in the long run because the Democrats will bring it up again. But the Republicans are just waving the white flag at this point in time when it comes to healthcare. They're just shutting up completely. I feel like that's probably where abortion will end up eventually. It'll just take a while to get there.
One of the ironies of this time is that, like, the window has opened for extreme abortion laws around the country after decades of trying, at a time where the Republican Party is beholden to a sort of all-powerful leader who doesn't give a shit about abortion and almost certainly procured them himself. Yeah. Additionally to the fact that Herschel Walker may be the 60th vote that legislates a federal ban. But I mean, Trump is definitely was pro-choice, we know, until quite recently. And I mean, he delivered the judges that created this landscape. But I mean, certainly it was one of those like behind-the-scenesy quotes that, you can take with a grain of salt potentially. But I remember reading at some point that he was unhappy with all these extreme laws because he sees it as a threat to re-election, and obviously is not a true believer in the pro-life cause. So it's a weird time. But I mean, funnily enough, like, if he continues to control the party, like, he might exert some pressure on that being a core issue, because it's certainly not something he wants to run on. And while I obviously appreciate the irony that you just noted, I mean, the reason for that we both know, which is that he's not the one driving this bus. It's the activists, not Trump. He's responding. He's being driven just like the rest of the world is, essentially. So it's a very complicated. Someone's got to do a real thesis on this. It's a really complicated power structure in the Republican Party at the moment, between who's in charge, between the base, the Trumpists and Trump, and the media, Fox News and the right-wing media. It's a complicated relationship. Yes, it is. Do you have any other areas in abortion you want to cover, or are we going back to No, I just that's kind of that's my overview.
That's pretty good.
I just think it is like a very complicated issue that's been treated very simplistically for a long time. And now that the landscape has suddenly changed, everyone is trying to figure out where to from here. And I think it's going to be a big issue for a long time.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm really glad that we began the Zoom session to finish that section off, because that was much better than anything I've read about these issues. So that's very good. Okay, we'll just revert back to the COVID track for a little while. I think we got about 40 minutes left here. So let's. I don't think we'll get to the third topic, the legislation after election. We can save for after the election. Surprise, surprise.
Or legislation never makes the cut.
That's okay. But let's let's see. We might finish this quickly. I don't think we will. We never do. Okay, schools. This was a huge source of contention during the pandemic, and now we can look back on it a little bit. The National Assessment of Education Progress tests kids every year. It's been testing them since the 1970s. There was a break in 2021 for obvious reasons. This year, they compared the results to 2020, early 2020, and they were abysmal. They were, for the first time ever, 9-year-olds lost ground in mathematics. They've been progressing for 50 years, and they lost ground. Scores in reading fell by the largest margin in 30 years. They basically wiped 2 decades of gains across the board. Now, some of those gains were small, bit by bit. They were very small, but they were still gains. And it might take 2 decades to get them back, for all we know. The decline spanned everyone, all incomes, all race levels. But so all income levels, all races. But they were markedly more losses for the disadvantaged people. So in terms of numbers, the top 10% of kids dropped 3 points in maths. The bottom 10% of kids dropped 12 points in maths. Black students dropped 13 points compared with 5 points amongst white students. And right across the board, the minority races dropped by more. The poorer people dropped by more. It's not hard to read between the lines there, I would have thought. Clearly related to how long schools were closed for, I would have thought, because the poorer schools were closed for longer. The richer schools usually found ways to work around the COVID and have better ventilation and have better resources for the teachers. I would
imagine also like access to technology and also having parents in the home that are able to homeschool and support homeschooling, like, which, you know, is a function of their education and their advantage. Exactly.
Number one, internet. That's just the first thing, internet. But number two, I went through it myself with my kids when they were home from school. If I wasn't in their face, they were just messing around their iPad. They were doing nothing. And I needed to be in their face. And I'm sure it's the same in America, that if the parent's not home in their face, then they were doing nothing. And guess which parents were out working? They were the poorer people. They were the so-called essential workers, essential for seemingly the first time in their lives, as far as America was concerned. They were all of a sudden the heroes, but they were out working, and their kids were home by themselves, or there were several kids with one parent who was half working or whatever. It was clearly more difficult for people where both parents weren't either working at home or not working at all. So absolutely, that all these go into it. Some have noted that there's causation issues here as well. Like they say, well, hang on, maybe the people whose lives were more affected by COVID responded more poorly. Maybe we all know that poor people and minorities got COVID more frequently, and got the bigger, like the numbers don't lie in that respect. So maybe if your mum's got COVID and your dad's in hospital, and maybe that's not good for your schooling. maybe it's the other way around. It's I can see that argument, but what I would say is that the International Journal of Educational Research looked at one of the great things about COVID. Well, not great, but one of the positive things about COVID is that it was easy to run tests because every country had their own issues and they're all slightly different. And the old faithful Sweden, they didn't close their schools, and Swedish primary schools never went home. They suffered zero learning loss. Zero. Even though there were people dying of COVID in Sweden as well. Zero learning loss. Not poor kids, not rich kids, no one. So that does suggest there's some kind of relation there. Obviously, there's a reason for that. People weren't, it's not like when they closed down the schools, they thought, oh, this will do nothing. Like, people were concerned about the effect it would have, but they thought when you balance them all out, it's better to not spread the pandemic, and it's better for the protection of both the kids and the teachers for them to not be around each other. Do you think it was a mistake? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's different in different areas as well, right? In terms of how long schools were shut down. I mean, I think that it makes sense in the beginning for schools to shut down when, you know, especially before vaccines and when everyone's just trying to like get a handle on what the hell is going on. But I mean, without having like a spreadsheet of how long things were closed in different areas, like certainly like it seems like there was a point in time where a lot of people and a lot of areas were like, okay, kids are not vulnerable to this disease and the teachers are concerned about coming back, but really like kids are suffering and need to get back in school. And there were areas where there was a lot of resistance to that, which was partly about protecting teachers. And I suspect also partly a bit political. Like, I think there was like a real anxiety in, especially like certain like demographics and areas of society, like a real anxiety about opening up. And I think that affected, you know, school boards obviously got very politicized and very kind of heated and even like vitriolic, like this debate. And I think, yeah, it was sort of maybe the evidence of how badly this was affecting kids was ignored in some parts of the country for too long.
Yeah. Look, I personally, feel like the advent of vaccines was a critical period after that. I understand totally closing down before then, but then after that you just go, look, you don't want to force a teacher into an environment where they feel physically unsafe. And I don't think that anyone should have been forced, but I do think they should have tried to open up schools and offered to pay teachers basically danger money to teach, like just to do whatever they need to do to get enough staff to keep the schools open, especially the poorer schools. And just to take whatever precaution you can. I don't care about masks or whatever, that never really bothered me. Like whatever precaution you need to take to try and minimize the risk, because of course, you know, this is their lives. I understand that. But, you know, it's the lives of the people working in restaurants and essential workers as well. It's their lives as well. But, you know, like, we wanted our toilet paper, so fuck you. Go back to work. Like, I feel like there's no reason why teachers should get a pass for that. Like, but just at the same time, I don't want to force them. I'd prefer to reward with carrots rather than punish with sticks. But yeah, I do feel like as soon as possible, getting the schools open after the vaccines would have made a big difference, because a lot of schools were closed through most of 2021 as well.
Yeah, and it feels like a lot of the support for the idea of keeping them closed for much longer was coming more from middle-class parents who had the capacity to, I mean, like, not that it was easy for anyone to have kids from home, and I know like you can speak to that, but like, but you know, like for people who themselves were working from home and maybe it was hard, but like they like it's doable, and you know you can like give your kid learning support if you're someone who yourself like was kind of academically minded and you know the product of a good education. But like, yeah, if you're like going off to do a 12-hour nursing shift while your like 8-year-old is at home, like you would have a very different perspective on the urgency of going back to school, and you're like, it's a risk benefit analysis for everyone, right? And I think like maybe as per usual, the risk benefit analysis was not calculated with the most disadvantaged people in mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think it's a bit of a class issue there in that decision. Actually, Fauci's been going a bit of a tour, a bit of a goodbye tour. I don't know how he distinguished that from the rest of his time, because he was on the media the entire last 3 years. But anyway, he's doing a bit of a goodbye media tour. And Jonathan Carl asked him about the schools issue, and this is what he said.
Was it a mistake in so many states and so many localities to see schools closed as long as they were?
I think in some case, I don't want to use the word mistake, John, because if I do, it gets taken out of the context that you're asking me the question on.
Well, did we pay too high a price?
Yeah, I would say that what we should realize and have realized that there will be deleterious collateral consequences when you do something like that. This idea that this virus doesn't afflict children is not so. It does. We've lost close to 1,500 kids so far.
But much less than the older population, obviously.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't discount that it does afflict children. So it isn't without consequences. If you go back, and I ask anybody to go back over the number of times that I've said we've got to do everything we can to keep the schools open, no one plays that clip. They always come back and say Fauci was responsible for closing schools. I had nothing to do.
I mean,
let's get down to the facts.
On one hand, he's right. He wasn't on any school board. He wasn't even the one making official recommendations. That was our old friend Walensky at the CDC. He was just an unofficial spokesperson for the government's science bodies. Like, his job is he's in charge of research. That's not his job to make recommendations. But a bit disingenuous, isn't it, to suggest A, he had no influence at all, and B, that he wasn't strongly implying for about 12 months that schools should be shut down. Like, he really was even if he wasn't coming straight out and saying it and saying, oh, it's important to try and work towards schools being open, etc. He was pretty heavily implying it, wasn't he? Like, is this a cop-out from him, or are you on his side?
Well, it is interesting to me that he basically tries two different answers, which is surprising because he's a smart man, and you'd think he would have, like, before his, farewell media tour, like, gotten his answer straight, because, like, he starts by saying, basically seeming to suggest that it was right to shut the schools down because kids also die of COVID, albeit at lower rates, but, the 1,500 kids, seems to suggest that he's saying, well, we needed to shut down because we need to save kids from COVID, before sort of zagging to, but actually I had nothing to do with it anyway, so, like, why are you even asking me? Yeah, I think even that response itself is a little bit kind of trying to have it both ways, perhaps.
Yeah, so this is actually my concern about Fauci. Like, Fauci's been vilified by a lot of people and hero worshipped by others. I've always been a little bit in the middle. I have a lot of sympathy for him, a lot of sympathy. I think he was on the high end of nothing the whole time. He had the hardest job in America for a while there. But I don't like that he's tricky. He is tricky. There is no doubt. He plays games with words. He finesses a little bit. He's a sneaky guy. He really is. And like, for instance, do you remember how at the beginning of the pandemic, how he kept changing his estimates of what levels were required to reach herd immunity? Sometimes it was 60%, sometimes it was 70%, sometimes 80%. And later on he admitted that he was massaging it based on the audience he was speaking to decide, like, to try and encourage them to go in the way that he wanted to. Like, he openly admitted that because he said, there is no actual answer, but the people are asking for answers, so I was giving them an answer which I thought would push them in the right direction. You just go, oh yeah, okay, well, that's not building trust. Certainly not when you admit it. And the best example for me was when he was jostling with Rand Paul in the Senate over and over again over gain of function studies. This was a multi-round bout, this one. And basically Fauci was defining gain of function. Like, Rand Paul was trying to get him to admit that NIAID, Fauci's group, had funded research that could be regarded as gain of function research with regards to coronaviruses. And the reason, they were making a very big deal out of this. It wasn't always clear why, although I think we kind of know in hindsight. But Fauci's position was, no, I'm going to define gain of function studies in a certain way that almost nothing that qualifies as gain of function. And then I will say, no, we weren't funding gain of function. And Rand Paul knew exactly what he was doing, and they were at each other all the time. And it was just semantics. They were both just having semantic battles. And that kind of annoyed me because it just came off as so slippery. I do want to emphasize before I let you in there, I do understand why he was doing that. I get that. Like, I get that he knew there was bad faith at play here from Rand Paul and from the people Rand Paul was doing the hard work for, where they were trying to run the line that the gain of function somehow would connected to actual COVID, and no serious scientific expert suggests there's any connection at all between the research that NIAID funded and actual COVID, even if it's a lab leak, which it may well be. I have no position on that, whether it's a lab leak or whether it was from an animal source. I don't know. Even if it's from a lab leak, the structure of COVID is nothing like the structure of the coronaviruses that they were working with under the NIAID funded study. So that they do not connect, but people are running that argument, and Fauci was clearly trying to head them off at the pass because he could see that's what they were trying to do. And in fact, in the end, it made no difference anyway, because Marjorie Taylor Greene still acts like Fauci's responsible for COVID anyway. Here, I've got a clip right here.
Finally, he is stepping down, but really he should be in jail, Steve. He should be in jail. The American people lost so much, and so did the entire world, due to Dr. Anthony Fauci's Dr. Frankenstein style experiment. And it's nice that he gets to just step down and retire, but no one's going to be celebrating, because Republicans in Congress, when we take back the House, Steve, we need to be investigating, and we should be locking up Dr. Anthony Fauci.
So that's what he's working against. So I get that. But so what's your take? What's your take on Fauci generally?
We'll just say quickly, I like that Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying we should be investigating him and we should be putting him in jail. It's like, we're going to preempt the findings of your investigation.
It's a very quick investigation. It was like half a second. She's efficient.
Yeah, I think like this kind of gets back to what we were talking before about the messaging around the vaccine and transmission as well. Like, I think people with good intentions like were in a difficult spot, because from the get-go there was so much misinformation and like so many people like actively spreading bullshit on purpose. There was like a concerted effort from the like general anti-vaccine movement to jump on the COVID vaccine and like build their audience or their base of anti-vaxxers in general off the back of this controversy. So like there were like all of these like organized and non-organized people online in the media spreading a lot of bullshit very aggressively. And this happening in a context where, you know, this virus was a surprise. So, I mean, there should, you know, I know there was sort of woeful general pandemic planning, but no one could plan for this specifically. And so everyone's figuring it out as they go along, which means that people are going to be wrong at various points. And like at the same time, they're trying to put out clear messaging, because I think the feeling is, you know, if we're trying to combat the Marjorie Taylor Greenes who are like saying a bunch of crazy shit, we need to be like equally simplistic and clear and repetitive and consistent in our messaging. Because if we try to be nuanced, people won't hear the nuance, people will hear the crazies. And I think that it's like, that's kind of true to an extent. But like I was saying before, like I think if you then start to get in a situation where, you know, things evolve and what you said before wasn't right, and you try to be tricky about it rather than being clear, like you're not going to convince the hardliners either way. And I do think if you start kind of being ambiguous and contradicting yourself over time, and just doing it in a simplistic and not straightforward manner by explaining the situation, like, yes, it's hard to communicate nuance, but I think that there are people who are like in between who see that and then start to be distrustful. And that to me is the problem. Like, you're not going to convince Marjorie Taylor Greene that she should go get a COVID vaccine. Like, she's definitely too far gone. Yeah. But like, I understand why people like who kind of go down a rabbit hole, or even like not that, but just kind of are wary or hesitant, start like hearing contradictory things and are like, well, what's that about? And don't have the time to kind of do the research about, you know, why the advice changed and everything. So I think it's kind of, as much as it's important to kind of be simple and clear, you know, in the context of emergency, I think the onus is also on the sort of experts to also find a way to be simple and clear about, what people get wrong.
Yeah.
And Fauci's done that at times, to be fair. Like, I think there are times where he's explained how the situation's evolved and stuff, but, that clip you played before was like quite a political answer, of like, I don't want to be taken out of context, so I'm going to frame it in this like tricky way. And I mean, that's also born out of experience, because I think he was attacked relentlessly in ways that were pretty unhinged. And so, like, I don't know what he was like in 2019 before all this started happening. Like, maybe he wouldn't have spoken that way back then, and maybe he's just been burned so much by people calling him like a monster and Dr. Frankenstein that he's become, like a bit more like political in the way that he phrases language. But I think he's like someone who probably tried his best in like the worst job in the world, pretty much. And not the worst, but a very challenging job. And he has gotten it wrong at points along the way, but I'm reluctant to knock him too hard for it, because I think he's been knocked harder than he should have been so many times by so many people.
Look, I think you nailed it there, actually, in terms of I think I remember saying this on the podcast at the end of last year, saying he's got to go, not because I hate the guy or anything like that, but just he's punch drunk. He's just taken too many hits. No human being can take that many hits without it showing some effect. And I do agree with you. I think he has become more political and more defensive over time, because he's just taken so many hits, and it's only human nature to start becoming a bit sick of it after a while, and to become like this is what's happened to Hillary Clinton. If you see Hillary Clinton from 30 years ago, she was a very different person to what she is now. Like she over time she became incredibly guarded and incredibly defensive, and you can understand why on a human level. If you get attacked enough, that's what happens. And I think there's a classic example. This is actually the clip which I played last year when I said Fauci's got to go. He's done just because he's starting to lash out now. I said back then he hasn't lashed out so much since, but I do think he's shown that defensiveness and slipperiness. This is the moment I'm talking about when he was asked in the interview about his Republican critics, in particular Ted Cruz.
Senator Cruz told the Attorney General you should be prosecuted.
Yeah. I'd have to laugh at that. I should be prosecuted. What happened on January 6th, Senator?
So yeah, he treats it like a joke, but there's a real sneer when he says that, and it's a real cheap shot, and it's unbecoming of his position. And I think that's just the moment he just basically that's a Fauci way of snapping. That's him just going, I'm sick of this. And I felt like someone needed to relieve him 12 months ago, because it just wasn't fair on him, and he wasn't doing as effective a job as he could, because he was just worn down by bullshit, essentially. So that's kind of my take on Fauci. That sorry, I've got G-Chuck going. That's my take on him there. That I think he's just like he's just a human being who did his best, but his best became, unfortunately, I wouldn't say not good enough, but the level of his best was lowering over time because of the attacks he was taking. Is my take. But anyway,
and also just like even like through no fault of his own, the baggage that gets accumulated over years of like hostile political and media rhetoric. It's just at a certain point, like when you're a public official and your job is to be a neutral conveyor of information, like even like through no fault of his own, he's just accumulated so much baggage in that position in these times that it's sort of, he can't really fulfill that function anymore, because there's just so many people who not only won't listen to him, but actively demonize him. And like the chances that anything he says is going to be received by Republican people, like just people out in the country, is pretty low at this point. So, I mean, it's not like, Biden puts a new person in there and suddenly everyone's paying attention, but
that's true.
At least it's sort of, I think, just like a bit of a clean slate. Like
it's a circuit breaker.
Maybe, yeah, exactly. Like maybe people won't like pay attention, but maybe they won't be quite so actively hostile either. Maybe they'll just stop caring because people are paying less attention in general with all the mandates gone and things like that.
I also feel that the that Fauci in a way is an avatar for the way the right and the left approach expertise. In that the left like to defer to experts to win arguments. Like I lose track of how many times I must have heard Jon Stewart refer to some professional association when arguing with a right winger probably 10,000 times over the last few decades. Like lefties like to go, oh, well, the official body of the doctors say this, the official body of the economists say this, etc. Was Republicans distrust expertise. They think it's often people hiding behind positions of expertise to push personal political agendas, and they're suspicious of expertise generally. And I feel like Fauci, the reason why the left loved him so much, he became so divisive. At one point in time, I think he had approval, at the end of last year, his approval amongst Democrats was 85%, amongst Republicans was 19%. I feel like Democrats just hero worshipped him because he represented expertise that they were elevating, that they were placing as much faith in as possible during the COVID epidemic of all times, of all things. And the Republicans were equally seeing him as the epitome of hiding politics behind expertise. And so that's, I feel, part of it as well. And that had nothing to do with him personally, although he is political. I do think that anyone in that position would have fulfilled the same role for both the left and the right. So go.
I was never a fan of the hero worship. We did a sketch on that in Planet America back in 2020. Yes. But I mean, not least because like throughout COVID, and this has been the case in Australia too with different states, like expertise is not a monolith. Like there are different doctors and experts who have had different opinions on the sort of various policies with COVID. I mean, certainly in Australia, and I mean, like Florida, like Ron DeSantis has his doctor, and other states have their doctors. Like it's, but like, I mean, even like outside, like, I mean, I know the Australian context better of the difference between all the states. Like the chief medical officers in the states and federally have not agreed on everything. So it is something that really annoys me in left-wing discourse where it's like, trust the experts. Like, I think we should respect experts for their expertise because they do know about more, they all know more about this than all of us. And so we should listen to what they have to say. But the kind of hero worship as if like everything they say is like, come straight from God to us to tell us like, I mean, you know, it's just like, it's pretty childish, I think. I mean, it's certainly very simplistic because it ignores the fact that like, we don't know everything. People aren't infallible, and like experts don't agree on everything, nor should they, especially if it's not, you know, an incontrovertible fact. And COVID, you know, was a new thing that people didn't know that much about until quite recently. So yeah, I was never a fan of that aspect.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Respect experts, don't worship experts. Experts can be wrong, and questioning them is healthy as long as you respect them when you question them. It's I think that's fair. I should say, by the way, on that science thing, that I'm not going to play the clip because I can't find it. But the thing which the right hang on Fauci more than anything is him saying, "I represent the science," during that same Ted Cruz interview, by the way. That was always taken out of context, by the way. When he said, "I represent science," he didn't mean, "I am science." He meant, in fact, I'll find it and put it in there.
Anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, there's a face, there's a voice you can recognize, you see him on television. So it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. That's dangerous. To me, that's more dangerous than the slings and the arrows that get thrown at me. I'm not going to be around here forever, but science is going to be here forever. And if you damage science, you are doing something very detrimental to society long after I leave. And that's what I worry about.
Now, Melina didn't hear it, but you at home did. What he was talking about was that when people attack me I'm standing in for science because they know they can't attack science. And so they attack me as a means of attacking science. And that is unhealthy because science is very important for us to respect. But that's not him saying he is science. It's him saying he's standing in for science as an avatar for their attacks to absorb. So that's a different thing. But I understand. That's what I think. I think it's part of the whole way the different sides see expertise. I'm just conscious of the time. So just very quickly, the thing I want to end up on is going forward. What are our problems going forward? Number one, China is a big problem. When I say that, China's zero COVID thing, it can't last. It just can't last forever because it's costing them economically compared to the rest of the world. It's pissing off the Chinese people more and more and more. At some point in time, they're going to have to stop. And because they're just falling further and further behind while they do that. Like they're not even releasing their economic figures at the moment because they're so bad. And so when they do, it's the old islanders being subjected to flu for the first time. There is going to be one hell of a pandemic in China when they finally stop zero COVID, because they've only had maybe 1 million people who've had COVID in China, full stop. And they're not that great with vaccines either, to be honest. There've been more people. There's a higher proportion of seniors who have gotten vaccinated and boosted in America than there have been in China. So they're a real sitting duck, especially when Omicron and stuff like that gets over there, where it can spread so much faster, and they just have basically close to zero resistance at the moment. Even they've certainly zero natural resistance. And even vaccines, as I said, they're not great with. So at some point in time, there's going to be a serious economic crash in the world because of China having one hell of a flu season. Like at some point in time, I don't know when that's going to be, but that's something we just need to be aware of is coming. Mm-hmm. Another thing is long COVID. We still don't know too much about that. The CDC estimates that 19 million Americans have long COVID. It's becoming more of an issue as time goes on. There's a study that from Scotland where tens of thousands of people that found basically 5% of people sick with COVID reported not recovering at all during this trial, which went for years. And about 40% said they hadn't fully recovered after 3 months, I think it was. Now, there's a UK study that had better results than that, which was 11% of people who caught the virus experienced lingering issues, such as weakness, muscle aches, and loss of smell. But that rate had dropped to 3% after 3 months. So that's after we don't exactly know where it is at the moment, because it's a hard thing to test because the symptoms are a bit woolly. When is it long COVID? When is it just something else? When is it whatever? It doesn't seem to be super severe. And the reason why we know that is because Omicron, everyone got infected with it. 84 million people got Omicron in America and 103 million got COVID before Omicron. Yet within 6 months, emergency rooms in America and hospital admissions were lower than they were before the pandemic. So if there was this massive long COVID wave, it would have kept on going through that 6-month period and they would have seen them in the hospital. As far as excess deaths go, excess deaths in America dropped to zero by April. And since then, there haven't been much. So clearly there isn't this massive wave of hospitalizations and deaths from long COVID. It's just affecting people on a non-hospitalized level, which might sound lame, but it affects people's lives because it affects the economy because there's an NBER story. People who have absent with COVID for a week or more are 7% less likely to be in the labour force 1 year later compared to otherwise similar workers who don't miss a week of COVID, even if they had COVID. And also there's a huge epidemic of brain fog at the moment with this. And this doesn't stop you working. It doesn't kill you. It doesn't stop you going to a hospital, but just affects your life. And I think it's kind of chronic fatigue in a way. Like it's got a lot in common with chronic fatigue. And 20 to 30% of COVID patients report brain fog 3 months after their initial infection, as do 65 to 85% of the people who have long COVID. It can affect you even if you don't have significant symptoms. It can affect young people. There's a Lancet study. This is a huge study. 185,000 children, 242,000 adults. 6.4% of people who had COVID had brain fog after 2 years in this sample, compared with 5.5% people in the control group. Now that doesn't sound like much. It's only 1%. That's 2 years later. 2 years later, 1% more had brain fog. So that's a lot of people whose lives are affected very, very badly. We just need more research. We just don't know. Apparently it affects the executive function of your brain. So when you're trying to focus attention on something or hold information in your mind, you can't. Like you're normal, but just when you try and concentrate, you just can't. And that would be extremely frustrating and quite scary, I imagine, if that happened. Personally, that's one of the main reasons I keep on getting vaccinated, because I'm worried about that. Like I just don't want that to happen. But anyway, so that's a whole issue, which we're going to learn more about over the next few years, I suspect, because there's a lot of research going into it. Do you have any brain fog, long COVID thoughts? Anything?
You said 5% of people who didn't have COVID had brain fog. Is that
Yes,
is that like a lockdown thing?
No, I think that's an old people thing, because there's a lot of old people that have brain fog as well, like just normally. Like, and also I believe in the same study they found 4.5% of older people developed dementia in the 2 years after COVID, who had COVID, compared with 3.3% of the control group. So once again, there's a bottom line of people who are getting dementia anyway, but just that extra percent, it adds up. Yeah.
My one thought, and this will sound flippant, but I actually mean it from a media communications perspective, is I feel like long COVID needs a rebrand to a different name.
Yeah.
Because long COVID sounds bullshit.
Yeah.
It does not sound like a medical term.
Yeah.
Because it's not. And it sounds like, from the first time I heard it, it sounded like a joke. And it sounds like the kind of thing that I imagine a lot of people on the kinds of message forums that I'm generally not in probably make fun of a lot. And as you say, those numbers, it's serious, right?
Yeah, like it is serious.
It is an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of lingering after effects, which is a thing that happens with viruses. So it's not surprising that it's also happening with COVID, but potentially worse and certainly at scale. And as I said, we don't know yet the full scale of how big this issue is, but like, even if it's small in absolute terms, COVID's affected so many people that, there's all kinds of burgeoning health issues we could have like coming down the pipeline with this that we just don't really understand yet, but it doesn't end up coming. So yeah, I feel like if we want people to take it more seriously, it should have a less stupid name.
That sounds wise. That sounds very wise. By the way, we don't even know what it is yet. Like we know that a lot of these people have traces of COVID in them years later. Like it never goes away, but we don't know exactly how that manifests itself, why that is and how that works. It's a lot of confusion, but branding, like you're right. It sounds silly on the surface. When you think about it, I think you're right. I think that's a good point. And the other thing I'd say is that America, like I've already said this, that America really needs to work out what they're doing with pandemics, because there's another one coming. Like forget variants, there'll be more pandemics. Climate change means more pandemics. There's hotter temperatures, more viruses. Animals being driven out of their habitat means more animals mixing with people, which means more pandemics. There's going to be another one, and America hasn't upgraded their ventilation. They don't have paid sick leave. They don't trust their experts anymore at all. The next time there's a pandemic, no one is going to be wearing masks or taking vaccines. The Democrats will. The Republicans won't. It'll be partisan from day one. They're kind of sitting ducks, and I'll just leave you with one stat, which is, if America had performed as well as the average peer nation during COVID, 1.1 million Americans would still be alive. I don't mean that if they'd done well. I mean, if they'd just done average, a third of the American deaths would not have occurred. America did badly, and next time they're going to do that much worse because of how they've left the last pandemic. So that is the reason why it's worth spending
At Melina Wicks on Twitter.
That makes perfect sense. Okay. Thank you so much, Melina, and good luck with your 5,000 shows that you are personally propping up, and good luck with the kid. And I will see you on the podcast and in real life very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.